All right, let's get started. Distinguished guests, friends, and colleagues, a very good morning from Manila, Philippines. I am truly honored to welcome all of you to this important webinar series prepared by the Asian Development Bank in partnership with Stanford University and the National Development and Reform Commission of the People's Republic of China. Today marks the first of a series of 3 events to progressively develop the Natural Capital Lab initiative. The virtual lab will serve as a test bed and a regional digital platform to integrate nature-positive solutions in order to mobilize public and private investments in natural capital, and to further expand and deepen partnerships for nature conservation and green development. Now, the long-term vision for the lab is to make it an ADB-wide initiative. In other words, to serve as an incubator and a catalyst for green finance, knowledge sharing, and collaboration across the Asia and Pacific region. Our goal is to formally launch the Natural Capital Lab as a regional digital platform at the 15th Conference of the Parties for the Convention on Biological Diversity, otherwise known as COP15, and this is now scheduled to take place in May 2021 in Kunming. So with this background, I'd like to briefly introduce each of our 3 very distinguished speakers for session 1 on the role of multilateral development banks and governments in the natural capital investments. I will begin by welcoming Ahmed Saeed, who is ADB's Vice President for East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific. And he will discuss how ADB, as the regional multilateral development bank in the Asia-Pacific region, can contribute and leverage support for this initiative in terms of financing, partnerships, and knowledge sharing, and how the Natural Capital Labs fits into the broader picture of our efforts to do the right things and do them right. We are also very pleased that Carlos Manuel Rodríguez is joining us today as the CEO and Chairperson of the Global Environment Facility and former Environment and Energy Minister of Costa Rica. Mr. Rodríguez is truly a leading expert in the development of payment systems and schemes for ecosystem services. Mr. Rodríguez was directly involved in negotiations to establish the Global Environment Facility and the Green Climate Fund, and he will speak to the role of the Global Environment Facility in financing investments in natural capital. Our third speaker for session 1 is Mr. Tong Zhongshun, the Director General of the Regional Revitalization Department of the PRC's National Development and Reform Commission. I learned that Mr. Tong has been the pioneer for developing and applying ecological compensation mechanisms in the PRC, and he has been working in this area for more than a decade. And Mr. Tong will share the PRC's experience with ecological compensation mechanisms and some plans for the future. So, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I would now like to invite Vice President Saeed to take the floor. Over to you.
Hi, good morning, Jim. I seem to be having some problem with my video.
Okay.
As for that. Perhaps I will have to do everybody a favor and not let them see me this morning.
Okay. All right. Well, fair enough. It's what you say that matters. So.
All right. Well,
okay.
We'll let them proceed, and then hopefully by the second session we can sort out the video. So, well, first of all, thank you, Jim, and thank you, guests and colleagues. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to participate this morning. This is a very, very important subject. This subject of the relationship between nature and finance. And, you know, the first thing that I wanted to say about this is, of course, that while we're here to talk about this link between nature and finance, of course, nature is a good unto itself. It's not merely a value because we can assign a financial value to it or a GDP value. But it is, of course, as we know, absolutely critical to our material welfare also. The World Economic Forum, for example, recently estimated that more than half of the world's GDP, $44 trillion of economic value, depends on nature and its ecosystem services to sustain our planet. And of course, this is, I would note, an underestimate, an enormous underestimate of the actual importance of nature to our lives and to our livelihoods. One lesson we have all learned, I think, in the aftermath of the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak is that the crises that are foretold do, unfortunately, eventually come to pass. And so we know with great certainty that we can no longer manage economic growth and environmental pressures separately. Governments and businesses will need to work together to navigate these challenges. And the only recovery, the only post-COVID-19 bounce back strategy is one that is nature positive. And that's the main reason we're here today, to exchange ideas, to solidify long-term partnerships, to build new ones, and to set the ground for future collaboration. I sincerely hope that today's discussions will help us all work together to enable more investments in nature. As a multilateral development bank, the ADB sits at the intersection of project design and policy dialogue amongst a broad array of actors. Our country counterparts, of course, especially those in developing countries, but also academia and think tanks, civil society, and business. Our unique convening authority and the legitimacy we enjoy as an institution allows us to more effectively bridge knowledge and trust gaps, and it is our ambition as an institution to use these intangible assets to promote more high-quality investments in nature. This is why our programs include both lending and non-lending assistance. Our technical assistance, for example, helps us bring technology and knowledge-based solutions, as well as capacity development into project design and project implementation. We have a long way to go together in terms of mobilizing private capital into projects with a conservation focus, in part because the business case for investing in nature remains poorly framed and understood. Creating an enabling institutional environment with the right mix of policies and governance arrangements will, of course, also be critical in incentivizing the scale of private financing that will be required. ADB is therefore working to foster regional transnational partnerships to encourage private sector actors to see the value of investing in nature and green development. I would, in this vein, like to highlight two flagship ADB initiatives in the People's Republic of China. The Yangtze River Economic Belt, where ADB has invested more than $10 billion over the last 15 years, and the Rural Vitalization Country Framework. These programs have been instrumental in piloting integrated approaches for watershed management, ecological restoration, sustainable agriculture, resilient food systems, rural-urban gaps, and poverty reduction. In the Yangtze River Basin, for example, ADB worked with the government and other partners to design a joint strategic framework program backed by lending support of $1.8 billion for environmental protection and rehabilitation. The fundamental innovation is the use of a geographical concept of a belt encompassing multidimensional economic, social, and ecological links. This was a step beyond traditional watershed management and moved away from traditional standalone interventions towards a more holistic protection of regional public goods. The upcoming Yellow River Ecological Corridor program will also implement a similar strategy in order to address the basin's complex development challenges. Institutional strengthening, regional coordination, and private sector engagement are going to be critical priority areas to support high-quality green development across the basin. To achieve ecological security in the Yangtze and the Yellow Rivers, biodiversity protection also needs to be scaled up in operations and at a policy level. And more work certainly needs to be done to catalyze private investment, since most funding for natural capital and biodiversity conservation has been from the public sector. Another initiative that will require cross-cutting partnerships to realize a regional public good and a shared outcome is ADB's new regional Flyway initiative. This new program aims to bring together development agencies, civil society, and governments to support key wetlands protection in Asia that are of critical importance for migratory waterbirds, livelihoods, and ecosystem services. I'm looking forward to hearing more about this later today. I also wanted to bring to the attention of those joining us today the new Natural Capital Lab that the ADB is in the process of establishing. This is a very important initiative for us as an institution, and it reflects our deep concern about severe natural capital decline, biodiversity loss, land use change, natural resource overexploitation, and pollution across emerging Asia. This effort will aim to promote nature-positive approaches across our region in four primary ways. First, through knowledge sharing, we will leverage some of the tools that already exist to capture the value of ecosystem services. In our region, the PRC has been a leading example of this. We will hear about some of the approach taken by the PRC in today's presentations. Other countries in Asia and the Pacific are catching up fast and also have a lot to share. Our hope is that the lab will become an open access platform where information on such approaches can be exchanged. Second, the lab will be a hub to share policy instruments, institutional and regulatory frameworks to incentivize nature positive investments and discourage activities leading to environment degradation. I mentioned private sector participation earlier, but of course it will always be government action more so than anything else that is essential for establishing appropriate regulatory incentives and market structures. Third, the lab will catalyze sustainable finance to promote integration of environmental, sustainable, and governance criteria into lending and investment decisions. Sustainable finance is an opportunity to address nature and climate-related financial risks more holistically, including through the private sector. When it comes to financing, we not only mean blending some of the finance provided by large commercial banks and corporations, we are also keen to support smaller fintech digital initiatives, which can be more easily accessible for SMEs in rural areas and can help promote the important goal of financial inclusion. Lastly, and importantly for today's seminar, the lab will build partnerships to share knowledge across sectors and regions, ensuring we all speak from the same playbook. In this connection, partnerships are being established with other MDBs, including the World Bank Group, the Inter-American Development Bank, and others. Some of our colleagues from these institutions are here today, and I'm pleased to welcome them to this virtual room. I'm also happy to see our long-term partners from the National Development and Reform Commission join us today. We have been working with them for more than a decade on ecological protection, rural development, and poverty alleviation across the PRC. Stanford University and the Chinese Academy for Environmental Planning have also been key knowledge partners and have done important cutting-edge work on natural capital accounting that I am looking forward to hearing more about later today, as I'm sure you are as well. I'm also happy to welcome our colleagues from the Global Environment Facility, with which ADB has been working closely since 2018 to support the Green Development Plan in the Yangtze River Economic Belt and pilot innovative eco-compensation mechanisms as well as green finance tools. And a special welcome to all the new faces in the room, including those from the private sector and civil society, with whom I'm expecting that we will be able to explore avenues for future collaboration. And finally, my sincere thanks to all panelists and participants from participating across the world. We're all excited to hear about your interesting work and to brainstorm with you about how we can join forces. Thank you, and I look forward to the remainder of the webinar, and let me see if I can sort this camera out as we proceed. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you very much, Vice President Saeed, for your inspirational words and also for outlining the role of ADB, our development partners, governments, and the private sector in this very important initiative. I would now like to turn the floor over to Mr. Rodríguez. Mr. Rodríguez, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Lynch. And it's a real pleasure to be today in this webinar on the Natural Capital Lab. And very grateful with the invitation from the bank, Stanford University, and the RC of China. The Global Environmental Facility is close to turn 30 years. This is the largest environmental fund, and next year we turn 30 years. In the last 30 years, the environmental fund has done a lot, but in terms of human development, if we see the last 3 decades, the effort of governments, multilateral agents has been tremendously successful in terms of human development. Today, people live longer, more educated, healthier, with more opportunities. And at the same level, governments has increased their level of governance, respect of rule of law, transparency, respect of human rights. Any way we can try to measure human development in the last 3 decades has been extremely successful. Of course, nowadays, the pandemic will be a major setback in terms of human development. If we see the impacts of the pandemic in human development, and we see our track record in terms of environmental conservation in the last 30 years, we have a very clear challenge in front of us. As I said, the Global Environmental Facility is turning 30 years next year, and even though human development has been the center of our nation and multilateral banks, and even the aspiration of the private sector, we haven't done much in terms of achieving our commitments and targets in terms of sustainability. In the last 30 years, we have lost probably 50% of the forest. In the last 30 years, we've been able to increase dramatically the weakness and vulnerabilities of climate change. In the last 30 years, we have lost almost 60% of the wild biomass. Today, we have 3 times more domestic chickens than wild birds. And we are en route to having more plastic in the ocean than fish. And even though we created this facility, the GEF, to deal with global environmental challenge, to assist developing nations in their commitment to achieve progress within the multilateral environmental conventions, we've been able to move the needle very slowly, very, very slowly. And I tend to believe that the pandemic is a great opportunity to really assess a few very important elements on how do we build back. And Mr. Vice President Saeed gave us a very clear idea on how important it is to build back better in a very different way. And we need to understand that at the end of the day, we need to be able to mobilize more financial resources. But most importantly, we need to be able to work with countries to generate more policy coherence. And these are, the 2 main elements that the Global Environmental Facility will be concentrating in the next few years in working with the implementing agencies and with the country. Even though we may be able to successfully raise more resources to our trust funds, that won't move the needle as we needed at the pace and at the scale that we needed, because we have 2 very specific barriers to deal with. One, the one I just mentioned, that has to do with policy coherence. The GEF invests around $1 billion per year in the implementation of the multilateral conventions. Nevertheless, the countries invest 500 times more resources in productive activities that damage biodiversity, damage nature, and damage natural resources. And that is the end result of what I call this lack of policy coherence. There's many reports. The Asian Development Bank, together with UNDP, did a report a few years ago that was very, very interesting, saying that in the Asian region, countries invest 50 times more financial resources in activities that generates loss of forest than what those same countries invest in forest conservation. And this is in part because of the way that governments has organized the public sector. Part of the challenges associated to the lack of policy coherence has to do with the institutional framework in the public sector. We have organized our governments through different agencies, and these agencies work on sectors or on silos. Even though we got an aspiration to sustainably manage landscapes and seascapes, if we see how we have organized that institutional framework, we still work on silos. So we got ministries of environment on one side doing the conservation effort, and on the other side, we got ministries of agriculture, ministers of energy and mines, all of them working with different visions in the same landscapes. And of course, we got a conflict of agenda, a conflict in the investments. And this is why those negative investments are way more higher than the conservation effort. So one very key element is being able to provide data and information and facilitate the political dialogues by which we can support the GF, the multilateral agencies, to governments to really recognize that there's an institutional failure. The same way we have recognized that there's an economic failure, and That is why the Natural Capital Lab is so important to deal with that economic failure. We don't recognize the positive externalities that people and companies do in protecting nature, and we don't internalize the negative externalities. We don't tax pollution, we don't tax the loss of forests, we don't internalize those negative externalities in the way we do national accounting. So we have very well identified the economic failure, but we haven't really done the same effort to recognize the institutional failure. Having institutions or an institutional framework that doesn't respond to our aspiration of sustainability becomes a major barrier. So here's where GF, Green Climate Fund, and the multilateral organizations need to facilitate those political dialogues by which we can generate a proper institutional framework, because we will never do the leap forward in terms of our aspiration of sustainability with the same institutional framework that has created in the first place the problem we want to solve today. So that's one key element that we need to work. And I tend to believe that the work that we've been doing goes in that direction, but we need to upscale and visibilize the challenge and the problem so we can generate more coherence in those national policies. And the second element, Mr. Lynch, which is extremely important for us, is the fact that we can mobilize way more resources than what the banks and the funds are doing. That won't be enough. Let me give you some numbers. The latest report indicates us that we should be mobilizing today around $700 billion to revert the loss of biodiversity, to protect and restore degraded lands and soils, so we can be able to be more resilient to not just to climate change, but to a full future pandemic. And actually, we are mobilizing around $100 billion from all sources. 80% of that $100 billion are public domestic expenditures. And the other 20% is what the multilateral banks are providing with bilateral cooperation, what the GF does, and the private sector invests in. And we only concentrate on thinking, how do we optimize those resources within that 20%? Very little effort is done in really helping countries be more efficient on how they mobilize domestic expenditures. So if we are mobilizing $100 billion and we got a $600 billion gap, the way forward is to mobilize resources from all sources. That means that we need to help countries assist them in mobilizing more efficiently the domestic expenditures. If I go to Vietnam or Myanmar or Cambodia and I ask the Minister of Finance how much money they are investing in biodiversity conservation, they don't know it because their budget and the budgeting system doesn't provide that information. We need to find like an archaeology. We need to hire an archaeology to go and dig into those public budgets to really find that information. If we don't have that information and don't have the information about the financial needs at the country level, it will be very difficult to narrow down that gap. And surprisingly enough, many countries are mobilizing way more resources than what they account for in terms of biodiversity conservation. There are many sectors investing beyond the Ministries of Environment or the National Park Service or the Forest Service. Many agencies invest one way or another in nature conservation. As we do the biodiversity expenditure reviews in the countries, we will have very good information to work with countries on how to narrow down that gap. So we need to approach in a very strategic manner the way countries invest in nature conservation, at the same time that we need to mobilize our resources from all sources, particularly in engaging the private sector. And I will finish by saying that the private sector is key in these aspects, and we'll be talking how do we tap on the capital market, on the financial market. And as of today, we have very interesting, good experiences with the private sector, particularly in blend finance, but that is not enough. And that is not enough because as of today, protecting nature and reverting climate change is not a good, sound business for companies. That means that we need to create the proper policies and incentives, and that requires a big work of our organizations with governments and public sector. So I thank you so much for the opportunity. We look forward to continue engage with the bank as an implementing agency of the Global Environmental Facility. Today, governments are going under a very stressful financial and fiscal situation, and this is the moment where we need to be able to provide good sound finance, grants, and good ideas on how to build back better. Thank you so much, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rodríguez. And I think ADB certainly looks forward to our continued partnership with you and the Global Environment Facility in advancing the Natural Capital Lab initiative, but also, as you said, in working together towards greater policy coherence, breaking down the institutional silos, valuing our natural environment, and trying to mobilize resources to close this $600 billion gap. So again, thank you so much, Mr. Rodríguez. Our third speaker for the session one is Mr. Tong, who will now speak about the PRC's experience with ecological compensation mechanisms and some lessons learned and some ways forward. Mr. Tong, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. I'm very glad to be here. And I'd like to talk about China's effectiveness of PRC's ecological protection and compensation mechanism in protecting natural ecological systems. And it's a pleasure to working together with ADB and Stanford University. First of all, on behalf of the Regional Revitalization Department of NDRC, I'd like to express my warm welcome to all the guests and speakers joining us today. From long term, we also receive lots of support from ADB for your support in the regional revitalization. And Chinese government has always attached great importance for the mechanism establishment. And since the 18th MPC, the central government has done lots of the arrangements for the ecological preservation. In 2019, President Xi has pointed that we need to establish the eco compensation mechanism from all around the ways. And in recent days, President Xi Jinping in the UN Biodiversity Summit has mentioned that we need to explore the harmonious coexisting between man and nature and have a balanced and coordinated development between the nature protection and economic development. So to build a harmonious and beautiful world for all. So based on the decisions and instructions from the State Council and central government, government agencies has introduced a series of the policies and regulations on eco-protection. That's including eco-compensation related arrangement and also other arrangements including regional eco-compensation as well as marketization and other plans to implement eco-compensation in different ways. So all these policies and arrangements have reflected our advantages as a socialism country. And it's also reflected what people are looking for. So it will help to improve the mechanism establishment for eco-compensation. So next, from the central government perspective, that there is more effort being taken on eco-compensation. In 2016, the State Council General Office has released the suggestion advices on eco-compensation, and it helped to establish the mechanism. So with the guidance from the industries, the investment and efforts in the eco-compensation from the central government is gradually expanding. And so far, the transfer payments has amounted more than 18 billion yuan in covering at least 1/3 of counties across China. That's covering the forest and the grasslands. As for the funds go to the forest and the grassland, it covers more than 36 billion yuan. So more than 50% of grassland is covered by this earmarked fund. And key projects have been carried out, that's including the Three River source restoration. The comprehensive restoration system is also kicked off. Next, from a local government perspective, there are more cooperation between regarding the eco protection. Local governments different local governments are trying to explore different ways for eco protection and eco compensation. So for the focuses are given to the source areas in different local government, and to build a mechanism that cost is being shared among all and benefit also shared among all. And many progress has been achieved. Xin'an River, Jiuzhou River, King River, Dong River, and Chaobai River, and Chishui River between different, which flows different provinces. And so multiple rivers because of those multiple rivers, multiple projects has been taking place that's involving different provinces from upstream to downstream. So the downstream provinces are supporting the upstream provinces. Third, the market-based and multi-facet ways are established. So for market-based, eco-protection compensation initiative is introduced. So under that, I would say that the carbon trading mechanism in China has already been established, kicked off, and many more pilot programs of the carbon trading have also been introduced. 1.6 billion yuan of water rights exchange has taken place, and 8 provinces in China have carried out pilot programs for the water rights exchange. So use these market-based mechanisms and methods. We are doing whatever we can to cut the carbon emission. So we would say that we are in a transition from a regional improvement to overall improvement. Over 7,000 hectares has been increased for the forest areas. 70,000 hectares. And for the sand erosion areas, has changed from over 3,000 kilometers, reduced to only 1,900 kilometers. So our efforts in the sand erosion area has leading in globally. The groundwater sections have been gradually increasing, and the bigger rivers and tributaries are improving as well. So the Green Mountain and Clearwater with such beautiful landscape is happening across the whole region. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, to improve the eco-protection compensation mechanism is a very complex project it not only needs the government pushing, but also takes the regional coordination between different regions. And on top of that, we also need general support from the whole society. Since beginning of this year, we have worked together with many government agencies about the lawmaking for the eco protection. So our objective is to summarize the successful experiences in the eco protection area, and also carry out the eco compensation at all round ways and stabilize the eco protection landscape. And we hope that we can create an atmosphere that everyone is responsible for the eco protection. And national financing subsidy are also established for the eco protection. So based on different ecosystem features, we have raised different subsidies, different range of subsidies based on different scenarios. So we have different categories and different levels for such subsidy. And the central government and the local government, they all have their own responsibilities in the ecological protection and restoration. As a result, we hope to establish a scientific evaluation process and also a very systematic adjustment system so that everyone carry out their ecological protection duties in a better way. Second, innovative mechanism has been promoted between the central government and local government. So based on the successful experiences on Xin'an River and others, we hope that we can meet all the requirements of the lawmaking and the contracting and agreement. Then that's the major responsibility falls on the local government, so that the local government, they can have more coordinated cooperation with their neighboring regions and provinces. And the central government is more playing a leading and coordinated role. So we hope that with the central government's help, that all the local government, they can reach their consensus and they can working together. More innovation is encouraged for the market-based mechanisms so that all parties can get involved in this regard. Guide and provide incentive for the hydro businesses so that they can have more cooperation with local government, villages, and farmers, so they can share the resources together. And as a result, we can transit from green mountain and clear water into the gold mountains. China's lawmaking mechanism is trying to explore more about the carbon allowance and water rights and wastewater discharge rights and areas, so that we can provide more legal framework and provide more bridges for different entities to join in the eco protection, and markets can be more improved. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, the COVID-19 has generated greater impact for our society. And against the globalization background, our fates are linked together. So for all the ladies and gentlemen friends joining today's meeting, we see that some of them coming from the eco-protection areas. We also have different representatives from different local governments in the eco-protection agencies. And we also have experts for the eco-compensation academic studies. So I hope that everyone can take this forum as an opportunity to proactively share your experience and exchange ideas. And we can push the eco protection into another level. And we can make our contribution to make a beautiful home for all human beings. And lastly, I wish you best of luck and wish you complete success of this forum. Thank you, everyone.
Mr. Tong, I'd like to thank you very much for your longstanding partnership with ADB in advancing eco-compensation in the PRC. And again, it's clear that the Natural Capital Lab will be key to scaling up and replicating eco-compensation, not only in the PRC, but also, as you said, Mr. Tong, regionally and across Asia and the Pacific. So ladies and gentlemen, we've concluded session 1. And again, I'd like to thank our 3 speakers, Vice President Saeed, Mr. Rodríguez, and Mr. Tong, for getting us off to a great start. Without further delay, I'd like to now hand it over to Mr. Warren Evans, who is ADB's Special Project Facilitator, and many of you know him, and he will really be the chair for the next session, session number 2. So Warren, over to you.
Thank you, Jim. So this session is about innovations for investing in natural capital. We have, if we're going to get back on schedule, we have about 50 minutes with 3 presentations and then a panel. Our first presentation will be by Martin Wilder on the HSBC Pollination Climate Asset Management Program, particularly on opportunities for collaboration. Martin is actually, from my day, best known for sort of being a champion of legal issues on climate change outside of the UNFCCC, or maybe supplementing the UNFCCC initiative, but a legal expert on environmental matters generally. He is a founding partner of the Pollination Group, which has now joined forces with HSBC for this new initiative, and we welcome him. The second speaker will be Professor Wang Jinan, who is one of China's leading experts on the understanding how you value environmental assets. And he's the academician for the Chinese Academy of Engineering and president of the Chinese Academy of Environmental Planning. He's also director of the State Key Laboratory of Environmental Planning and Policy Simulation. And it sounds like a fascinating institute, particularly for those of you who enjoy policy stimulation. Then the third speaker will be Ms. Patricia Zurita. Patricia is the CEO of BirdLife International. She used to be the executive director of the Critical Ecosystem Partnership Fund, which was is still a major initiative on protecting ecosystems, partnership with World Bank, CI, GEF, and others. And one thing that you won't see on her biodata is she actually was one of the early experts or researchers, I should say, looking at valuing natural capital and accounting for natural capital when she was in WRI. And then we'll have a panel after these 3 presentations. Each of these will be about 10 minutes. And then we'll have a panel which will be VP Ahmed Saeed, who you've already met, DG Tong, who you've already met. And then we're really lucky to add to that panel Dr. Gretchen Daly, who is a real pioneer on valuing and accounting for natural capital. She was a founder of the Natural Capital Project at Stanford, and we are really, really lucky to have her here. She's been a leader in this area for as long as I remember becoming acquainted with this area of work. So we welcome her as well. So we'll have 3 presentations, 10 minutes each, and then the panel. So Martin, if you would start off, please.
Okay, thank you very much, Warren, for that introduction. It's much appreciated, and it's very nice to see you all. I guess just as Warren said, we set up Pollination around just over a year ago now as a specialist firm to look at investing in the climate area, both investment and advisory work. At the start of COVID, we began to have a discussion with HSBC around what some of the key areas that needed to be invested in order to help us deal with the climate change issue. And very quickly, we agreed that the one area where there still needs to be a significant amount of institutional capital is in natural capital. And one of the challenges has been that while a lot of the investment into nature to date has really been around, I guess, philanthropic investment or organisations like, as you mentioned before, CI and others very active in that space, we really wanted to see a way in which we could bring the very large pension funds who have expressed significant interest in protecting natural capital together to actually start investing in the space. So at the start of the COVID period, we began to pull together with HSBC this idea of a natural capital investment platform, which we launched a few months ago. And in effect, what the platform is the theory has been that what we need to do is to really create a new asset class. So that asset class in itself, from an institutional investment point of view, is natural capital. So when we talk about natural capital in that sense, what we're talking about, it's a broad spectrum of investment, but that investment includes investment in regenerative and sustainable agriculture, sustainable forestry, sustainable fisheries, water, and then biodiversity and wildlife. And I think the important thing here is that the investments that we are making are in those areas of intersect between economic activity and nature, and where you use nature in order to produce economic outcomes such as food, water, timber, etc. And at the same time, you do that in a more holistic and sustainable way that also produces benefits around biodiversity or around soil carbon or the like, so some of which can be monetized to date and will make a significant additional return on top of the more traditional investment. Now, one of the challenges that we're very aware of is that at this point in time, the real area that would give traditional economic return to investors is more in that regenerative agriculture space or that sustainable forestry space, as opposed to the wildlife space. But we do believe that over the next 5 to 10 years, those areas of investing purely in wildlife or biodiversity will provide an economic return. And in some jurisdictions, we're already seeing governments pay you under public-private partnerships or other arrangements to actually restore or protect biodiversity and wildlife. And so the theory here really has been to bring to launch this funds platform, and the first fund is designed to be a $1 to $2 billion fund investing in that natural capital space, and to really drive that very hard. And the focus is on a long-term fund of 15 plus years, and to have institutional investors that are investing around $100 million plus. In the discussions about the need for this investment, there was a very clear agreement that this had to be done at scale and at speed. And that traditionally a lot of the investments in this space have been fairly small scale. And so you really need to bring a large amount of capital to drive change. And I think that has very much been the theory behind the fund. Secondly, the other area that the businesses also will be focused on is investing in very large scale nature projects that deliver a range of benefits across nature, but is largely funded by carbon. So as we know at the moment, there are many companies around the world that are claiming they would like to reduce their Scope 3 emissions or have set targets for corporate goals to reduce emissions. And the key challenge that we believe is that there's a limited amount of high quality Paris compliant carbon in the marketplace. Now, the challenge to date in investing in these sorts of red type projects has been that these projects traditionally get a very small amount of capital up front. They try to develop the projects and they sell a small amount of carbon. And then what ultimately happens is that carbon then is used to fund the projects. we think that you have to view nature like infrastructure, and that at the end of the day, what is absolutely critical is to look at what are the very large areas on the planet of critical nature that's at threat. What if you were to allocate $100 million to a particular nature project, and in doing that could then generate significant amounts of protection of that area and carbon and other biodiversity benefits in a rapid way, that will quickly help escalate the protection of those areas. So we think that if you build any sort of infrastructure project, you generally get project financing, and then you get that project finance repaid from the benefits of that infrastructure. We believe that nature should be seen in the same way. Finally, the other key driver about the venture that we've set up with HSBC is that, and I think again Warren mentioned this. I know that Gretchen will touch on this. Absolutely critical to anything that we do is the ability to value nature, and at the core of this fund is a lot of work that's been done on how you value those investments to ensure that the return you're getting is both a physical return, but also a financial return. What was interesting was that we have people within the business who previously have done a lot of work in valuing national parks or game reserves that have been sold, and actually valuing the nature from a financial perspective as opposed to a physical perspective, so that they could be put on a balance sheet. And so around the world, in countries like in states like Queensland and Australia, the government has a fund that buys carbon, but it also pays those people undertaking activities to restore watersheds or to restore habitats of certain species. And so that Queensland government program does adopt a range of metrics to do that, but it's still very early days. The interesting thing was when we launched the fund, we've had almost 40 different groups approach us to say that they are valuing nature and they know how to do this. And we've been progressively going through to work out who's actually doing what. So that's been a very useful exercise. But the theory here is that we'll very much value it both from a physical and from a monetary point of view, and develop those metrics for a public good and work with others who want to do that as well. So we think, and then finally, the final comment I'll make on the venture is that since it has been launched, we know that a number of others are also thinking about how to do similar sorts of funds. And from our perspective, that's fantastic, because the more capital that moves into investing in natural capital, it becomes a more mature asset class. And the sooner it becomes a mature asset class, then the more money will go in that direction. So it's been an interesting few months. We're highly committed to this, and the platform, is over the next few years aiming at raising $6, maybe $10 billion. I'll leave it there, Warren.
Thanks, Martin. Let me ask you a question before you go off. So the Holy Grail are institutional investors. That's been the Holy Grail for a long time. Are you having the best luck with sovereign funds or with pension funds or both? How, do you have can you give us an idea of where you're making the most progress?
Yeah, so it's fairly early days, but we've been having discussions with both pension funds and with sovereign funds. And the most interest, I guess, is coming out of Europe and Asia. Most of the US funds have said, please wait until after the election and then come back to us. And just to be brutally honest, and so that, not necessarily in a negative way, but I mean, there's a lot of fluidity and focus there on other things at the moment. But I think what's been interesting is that what you'll find is that traditionally a lot of the pension funds and the sovereign wealth funds have done a little bit of investing in ag or a little bit of investing in timber, but they haven't really done it in the sense of regenerative ag or sustainable timber, or in a combined pool of assets. And so I think what has become quite interesting for a lot of the players we're speaking about is the fact that you're bundling a group of nature's assets together, and then that also provides them where they have a much broader portfolio and they're trying to divest from fossil fuels and they're trying to hedge the overall risk of their overall portfolio. This does provide a little bit of complementary hedging across that portfolio. So the interest has been very strong. And I think the other thing is that we've found is that there are quite a few funds that traditionally may not have or have moved away from doing fund-to-fund investments, except in areas that are new. So where there's a new asset class and they feel they can learn a lot, then they're very interested in looking at the space. And so that's been our sort of learnings to date, I think.
Okay. Thanks very much, and best of luck on that.
And so the last thing I'd say, Warren, what's also very interesting is that most of the very large pension funds, particularly the Canadian funds, the European funds, have put in place people who are now their head of natural capital investing. They may not be entirely across what that means or where that's going, but what we've seen is all of these funds have allocated individuals to run that, to basically have a key focus on the area, which again demonstrates a sort of a seriousness of interest.
Great. Thank you very much. And good luck with this. It's really important, and we'll want to follow the progress on this.
Thank you.
I would now like to invite Dr. Wang, whose screen is being shared now. And by the way, I just learned this myself. If you don't know how to get this in English, and you do need to look at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and there's a language button. I just learned that this morning. So thank you very much again, Martin, and Dr. Wang, over to you, please. Dr. Wang, I think your mute is still on. Your mute is still on. Yes, thank you.
行，不好意思，各位女士、各位
Apologize. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Today, I'd like to talk about the guidance on calculating the green gross ecosystem product GEP to carry out eco-compensation and the green finance mechanisms.
3个方面的
So there are 3 areas I'd like to talk. First one, so with the Institute of Environment Planning, what kind of jobs we have been done so far. So I've been doing this ecological and also the economic eco-related economic calculation for more than 16 years. So the first time was when the President Xi Jinping had a meeting in Zhejiang. So we had this first meeting, and in that meeting, the President Xi Jinping was still the party secretary of Zhejiang province then, and he has given this idea. So in China, one phrase is now very popular, means the green is gold. So in the past 16 years, we have started the green GDP calculation from 1.6 version to version 3.6. So if we look at 1.0 version, that is, we have calculated the RDC and EDC, while the version 2.0 is we are calculating the GEP, the gross ecosystem product. By so far, the Ministry of Environmental Ecology has issued the first technical guideline on GEP accounting. So China in different regions are using this accounting as a reference. In the meantime, we have calculated 4 years between 2015 and 2018, what kind of GEP would look like for the 13 first provinces across China. So across China, there are 13 provinces, 20 cities, and 6 counties have carried out a GEP calculation. And recently, we have finished the GEP calculation for 179 countries across the globe. So starting from 2015, we have started the Green GDP 3.0 version with a new concept. We call it Gross Economic Ecological Product, GEEP. So GEEP is really reflecting the values of the natural system. And so the traditional GDP minus the pollution cost and ecological destroy cost. Then we have this GEP. So we also released this GEP calculating and accounting guidelines. We have already made huge progress from 2015 to 2018, and we have completed the GEP calculation for the all 4 years, covering whole China. And it has generated a great influence across China. So many provinces come to us and ask for this report as a reference. This shows the 2018 that the GEP of 31 provinces. You can see the highest GEP in 2018 was Inner Mongolia. But Guangdong province, it has a high GDP, but GEP is relatively lower. But Inner Mongolia and Guangdong province, they have big difference in their economic situation. So therefore, we have a new idea recently that is how to develop the quaternary industry of eco-based products and services. As you know, that for the calculating of GEP, there are 3 elements. First one is EPV, second is ERV, and the third is ECV, ecosystem cultural valuation. So based on our current calculation elements, you can see from this table that 2.1 to 2.9 are all in the range of the ERV, ecosystem regulation valuation. So based on the calculation, you can see that more than 17% of GEP is based on the number 2 part, which is GRV for the regulation valuation. And the primary change rate of GEP was about 30%. So if the first element, third element, can be reflected in our current existing GEP calculation. So part of the ecological products has already been transferred into the GDP. So that's why we call it primary change rate or primary transfer rate. But for different provinces, some provinces hit a very high percentage, while others relatively lower. You can see from this chart. Now, everyone pay their attention that because our GEP is very high, so how can we turn the GEP into the green mountain clear waters? That is a very hot topic that local government pays lots of attention to. So how we can do this transfer? That is a new topic and new area of focus. So therefore, we have proposed that we need to establish a quaternary industry, which is based on eco products and eco services. So by definition, the quaternary industry is based on eco product and eco services to increase the value of eco product service. So we can have ecological products being tradable and to create its economic value. That is a very high level definition. The quaternary industry is different from the first, secondary, and tertiary industry. The first, second, and tertiary industries are providing service for people or people-centered, while the quaternary industry's objective is to have a harmonious coexistence between man and nature. So we need to have this harmonious relationship. And what is more important that the natural system, so we are providing this service for the natural system. That is what the quaternary industry is. To this end, we have these tasks on this slide. The first one is we need to have natural ecological capital accounting. Second, we need to have the establish ecological product and markets so that we can have pricing and trading. The third task is we need to establish a green financing instrument, because we cannot only have demand, but we also need to have the platform and the instrument. And therefore, during the National 14th Five-Year Plan, that's why we propose to establish a natural capital lab during the 14th Five-Year Plan. Next one, let's talk about the China's Natural Capital and Eco Product Lab. So this is the International Lab of Natural Capital and Ecological Products. And the research topics including the 5 areas. The first one is have the natural capital and eco product accounting methods. And second, we need to have the policy mechanism to promote value realization of those eco products. As you know that Chinese government is now in the process of discussing how to realize the eco products values. And third, we need to have green financing innovations and practices. Number 4, we need to do more research on the quaternary industry innovation practices. So how can we make that happen? And lastly, we are exploring with local governments and international communities to see what kind of typical models and demonstrations of value realization of eco products are available. And this lab is a dynamic one, an open one, and an international one. And myself is very interested, and I'm the lab director. And also, I'm reporting to the leaders in MEE. And we hope that before COP15 of next year, we can establish this lab. And this lab, we will invite lots of international experts, including from ADB, Stanford, GEF, and others to join us, so we can work together on this objective. And all these institutions, as mentioned, they already have some experience in this. As for domestically, we hope that we can work together with Tsinghua University, Zhejiang University, and Research Center for Eco-Environmental Science, Chinese Academy of Sciences, so that we can all work together. And especially, we hope that under this lab, we can establish the Quaternary Industry Research Institute, working together with Zhejiang University. And so Zhejiang province and Fuzhou city and Anji County. You know that Anji County actually is a place where President Xi Jinping raised the concept of green mountain is gold mountain concept. So Anji County and Huzhou city of Zhejiang province, we'd like to working together with them to talk about what types of industry, what characteristics this industry have, and what category of product service, and what kind of eco product service, statistical price and value accounting we can have, and so how we can reflect that in the value accounting system and others. So all these topics are what we are going to do in this lab. So that's all of my report. Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Wang. Can I ask a quick question? Is there enough analytical work since 2015 to indicate whether the trends in the gross ecological product nationally or in key provinces? Do you have enough information to know what the trends are? Is it going up, going down? Thank you.
Currently, after several years of research, General would say that our GEP is increasing annually, especially if you're looking at from the 2015, the green GDP is starting from 2014. So we see that the pollution cost or pollution loss is diminishing, while GEP calculation is gradually increasing. And the second, we see different provinces, when they added GEP as part of green GDP, we've seen that their rankings has big changes. I think this is also the reason why the different provinces, they have different functionalities across China. For example, Qinghai, Tibet Plateau, we are supporting them with eco compensation policies because they have different functionalities, different areas. But if we look at different provinces level, for example, Zhejiang province, they have very clear trend. While comparing to Western provinces like Northwestern, their GEP is very high. And the Zhejiang provinces, those regions, we are giving them special policies. So we see lots of values from these statistics.
Okay, thank you very, very much. This is a fascinating introduction to an extremely important initiative, and we look forward to, from the ADB side, obviously, ADB looks forward to working with you on the lab. Our last speaker for this session is Patricia Zurita, and I've already introduced Patricia. She's going to talk about not a new initiative, but maybe scaling up an ongoing program of support for the Australasia and East Asia Flyway that links directly into this topic today. Maybe Professor Wang, if you can unshare your screen. Thank you. Patricia, over to you, please.
Thank you, Warren. First of all, big thanks to you. And it is an honor to be with all of you today. And I wouldn't have thought in my wildest dreams when I was starting my master's degree on economics at Duke, and I was reading Gretchen Daly, that I was going to be sharing a session with her. I am incredibly honored. As you heard, my name is Patricia Zurita. I'm the Chief Executive of BirdLife International. Let me see if I can make this go on slide mode. There you go. And what I wanted to talk to you today was about the conservation and restoration of sites in the East Asian Australasian Flyway as a potential new model, and recapping a little bit some of the messages that we heard from both Dr. VP Saeed and the representatives of the PRC of how this is a really important opportunity for us to move into a new direction. First of all, for those of you who don't know about BirdLife, BirdLife is a family of over 115 organizations around the world. All of them are autonomous local national organizations that come together under the banner of the BirdLife family. We are the largest partnership for nature, and we've been around almost 100 years. One of the things that brings together BirdLife is the incredible and amazing phenomenon of the bird migration. We have incredible migrations of birds going and connecting us and reminding us that we are living in one single world, and that nature knows no borders, and that we need to be working together in order to make nature be alive and sustained over time. This is just a map of the Africa-Eurasia Flyway, and how the species that go from Asia, Central Asia, Europe, connect with Africa and the Middle East and the Gulf, and how all of us are part of one single system. And it's not only the soaring birds, the big birds that are flying throughout this incredible migration, but also tiny little things. And Warren and I, who used to live in, and Ahmed, who used to live in the East Coast of the United States, would have seen this every year with the ruby-throated hummingbird flying from Central America to North America every year and back, and crossing the Gulf of Mexico. I mean, you can see on the bottom right how small that bird is, and despite of that, it actually makes this incredible journey every single year. And only a month ago, or a bit over a month ago, we had the record of the longest nonstop flight of a bird broken by a godwit, flying from Alaska all the way down to New Zealand in 11 days, 12,000 kilometers nonstop. This bird just went straight from Alaska to arrive in New Zealand, in Auckland, 11 days later. Now, the problem is that the migration, as what happens with the rest of nature, really is is threatened, and it's threatened because of our intervention on the natural world. We have transformed coastal wetlands, and we are degrading key sites that are incredibly important for birds and other species to use. We are using our lands in an unsustainable way, and we are degrading habitats faster than we have ever done in the past. And you heard it from Carlos Manuel. We are investing more on destroying nature than protecting it. And we are setting up infrastructure that is creating conflict with wildlife and not making it easier. And there are ways of making this a much safer transition to renewable energy that doesn't really jeopardize our nature. So we know that nature is at risk. In the last 50 years, over 65% of the wildlife populations have plummeted. I was absolutely shocked to find this statistic that over 90% of the wetlands of the world have disappeared in the last 3 centuries. And in 2019, we almost lost 12 million hectares of tropical forests, so 1 football pitch every 6 seconds throughout the year. And you have heard probably from all of the marathon of the UN General Assembly and the meetings that we had with the UN in September, we have failed to meet all of the Aichi targets set up by the Convention on Biological Diversity back in 2010 in Nagoya. And the problem with this is that when nature is at risk, so is humanity. We are finding that we are in this situation, the European countries are going back into lockdown. We actually, in the UK, I live in Cambridge in the UK. We just went back on lockdown yesterday. And we are living through a pandemic that is the consequence of the way that we are actually treating nature. And we don't realize that the cost of preventing further pandemics in the next decade is only 2% equivalent to protecting wildlife and forests. So by investing in nature, we will be investing in our health in the future. As Ahmed said it before, 50% of the global GDP is potentially at risk because of our dependence on nature. Business depends on nature, and 50% of that dependence comes from nature. Over $165 billion in worldwide economic stress is coming because of the damage of nature through natural resources and the damage of capital because of natural disasters in 2018, and 50% of that was not insured. And we have the opportunity of really building up much better. You heard it from Warren. This is the time where we can take advantage of this crisis to really rebuild in the short and the long term, strengthening health services and putting place targets in stimulus to reignite the growth and support the private sector in getting money directly to people, but making sure that nature is at the heart of that. Half of the Fortune 500 companies mention biodiversity in the sustainability reports, but only 5 of them are actually specifically measuring. And I was so happy to hear from Martin that you are looking into asset valuation that is not only related to return on investment from agriculture or sustainable use of resources, but also for the value of nature. Now, the interesting thing about this is that conservation can happen, and conservation has resulted in extraordinary recovery of nature, but also incredible opportunities economically speaking. This is just one infographic that comes from our State of the World Birds that was published in September, showing the impact that both the CRP, the Conservation Research Program, the forestry title and the wetlands easement in the Farm Bill in 1990, and the grasslands easement in the Farm Bill of the United States had impact in either slowing or even increasing the status of nature in wetlands, forests, and grasslands, measured by birds, but this is indicative and a great example of how it happens with the rest of the species and the rest of nature. So when we give nature a chance, it actually comes back, and it actually is not as expensive as what we are seeing the impact of not taking care of nature to our economy and our health. Now, the East Asian Australasian Flyway, for those of you who don't know about this, is the largest migratory corridor on Earth. It actually connects the northern part of Asia and even Alaska in the United States, all the way through to Australia and New Zealand, and extends into South Asia and Southeast Asia. It is the most densely populated flyway because it has a lot of largest centers of human population and mega cities all over the flyway. And it's also the most threatened flyway in the planet. 61 species of the birds that use this flyway are either critically endangered, or vulnerable. And that trend is increasing very, very quickly. And it is basically because we are intervening and destroying the key areas that the birds use through the migration. Now, the hopeful message of this is that we're seeing incredible leadership. In February 2018, the government of the PRC decided to stop the reclamation of wetlands in the Yellow Sea. And later on last year, they moved into the very bold decision of inscribing the Yellow Sea and the Bohai Bay wetlands as a World Heritage Site denominated by UNESCO. This is a picture of the meeting in Baku, where the decision was made, and organizations like BirdLife and many others who are in favor of protecting this incredible flyway were helping and supporting the PRC and the governments that were making the decision to ensure that we were protecting and nominating the Yellow Sea as a World Heritage Site because it deserves to be so. Now, we are living in incredible times with the impact that the COVID pandemic has created in the planet, but it is also an opportunity to use this crisis as a recovery and a bounce forward moment for the planet. And when we think about the flyway, we see this as an incredible opportunity, as a perfect blueprint for us to be able to not only restore and protect these sites around the flyway, but use this as an opportunity to create jobs, reignite the economy, empower local communities, generate sustainable income for them, provide green infrastructure for climate adaptation and climate and the impact of climate change, and protect unique biodiversity. So why does this relate to natural capital? We are seeing that investing in nature, investing in our stock, and I was very pleased to see the definition of the gross ecosystem product that was just presented, because the more that we can actually invest in our biodiversity and our nature as a base, the more that we will have benefits for society and for business. Now, I wanted to share with you a couple of slides that were shared, and Duncan is in the room a couple of weeks ago when we had a webinar hosted by the Asian Development Bank launching this Flyway initiative that has two big components: an investment pipeline that will enable us to scale up investments at key sites in the Flyway, working with ministries of environment, planning, and finance, local partners and communities, and supported by multilateral and bilateral partners through loans and grants, but with a component of also sustainable financing mechanism of grants that can help us enable mobilize civil society and academia and local communities to ensure that we are protecting and restoring key sites on the Flyway. We're looking at a big project throughout the Flyway that is connecting all of the important sites of that the migration requires, not only in China, but throughout Southeast Asia, in ensuring that the Flyway enables not only the migration of birds, but also the recovery of the economy of these local communities after the COVID pandemic. It is intended to be a 30-year initiative with an initial 10-year investment that will help us really focus on key habitats, both in China and Southeast Asia, restoring and protecting coastal sites that are incredibly important, not only for birds and biodiversity, but also for people. We believe it's truly possible, and we heard it from President Xi at the UN General Assembly in September. There's not only the big belief of the eco-civilization, but also that by investing in nature, we will achieve a win-win both for ecological conservation and high-quality development. And that's what we are after. This is an incredible opportunity to really launch a big initiative that helps us secure not only incredible values and restore incredible habitats for biodiversity and nature, but it actually demonstrates how important it is, that connection with the development of socioeconomic values and empowers communities and local people. So I will leave it with that. I wanted to make sure that I put a picture of these amazing birds. The Spoonbill Sandpiper is one of, if not the most threatened species in the East Asian Australasian Flyway. It nests up in Kamchatka and Siberia and flies throughout the Flyway, stopping at the Yellow Sea to refuel and then going down to Southeast Asia in the wintering months. And it is an opportunity to demonstrate that we have the power to bring these ecosystems back. And they are important not only because of the economic value that they can provide to people, but they are important on their own right. So I would very much welcome your questions, and I'm incredibly grateful to the leadership of the Asian Development Bank, because pushing projects of this nature with the magnitude and the scale that the initiative has will enable us to demonstrate that it is possible and that we can create the momentum that is needed, as Martin was saying, in terms of the urgency, the speed, and the scale. So thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I hope that we can move this initiative forward quickly.
Thank you, Patricia. I'm actually not sure how the Q&A is going to work here, but we're running short on time. So I'm going to go straight to the panel. I'd like to first ask DG Tong, what are your expectations on the eco-compensation innovation in China for the upcoming 14th five-year plan? What are your expectations? What's this going to generate? And let me go ahead and ask the next two questions for our other two panelists, so they'll have the advantage of having a little bit of time to think about this. And I see that Ahmed, now your video is working. That's great. Let me first, Dr. Daly, I'm gonna ask you about some of the natural capital projects, key tools that you've seen evolve since 2005, and where you think this is going in terms of application. And then finally, Vice President Saeed, I'm curious how you see the expansion of the really solid work that's been done primarily in China, and how are we going to move that at scale into Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the other two regions that you have the pleasure of being responsible for here at ADB. So let me go back to Dr. Tong. What are your expectations on the eco compensation for the 14th five-year plan? Thank you.
哎，好，这个中国这个生态保护补偿机制方面的建
China's eco compensation has already achieved some progress during the 14th five-year plan. So what kind of innovations and practice may happen during the 14th five-year plan regarding eco compensation? In recent central government meeting has already mentioned that during the 14th five-year plan period, there are several objectives of eco and economic development, that's including the eco development. Especially, it said that we will improve the market-based and various method-based methods for the eco compensation. So the following three aspects will be the key area for innovation and practice. The first one, we have more legal framework for the compensation. Currently, State Council has already introduced lots of measures and regulations for the eco protection and compensation. Local government have carried out many explorations and practices on the eco protection and compensation. I would say all these efforts has already seen some results. Next step will systematically to summarize the successful experiences for eco compensation. And for those results, we will get the summary of the successful experience and what's feasible. Then, through legalization, we can make sure that our legal framework is sound, so that eco compensation can have law-based practices. That's number one. Number two, the main bodies of compensation should also adopt a market-based direction. Currently, the eco compensation participants, major participants, are governments at different levels and also farmers and herdsmen. As for the fund of compensation, usually come from the finance, government finance, and we have lower proportion of the fund coming from the private side. So the path and the method for the private funds to involve in the eco compensation haven't been established yet. So as a next step, we need to foster and improve this market system for the eco protection compensation, so that a government-led and business and society can widely participate in a sustainable mechanism can be established for eco compensation. And we hope we can inspire the whole society and the public to join in the eco protection. Third, the method of compensation needs to be more diversified. Currently, the eco compensation practice is mainly providing subsidy of compensation. This is more high efficient and doable and easy. But from long-term perspective, the regional, we would say that different components need to have a free flow among regions so that they can allocate their resources. Therefore, as next step, we need to pay more attention on the industry transfer and talent training, coordination, and co-establishing some cooperation projects, so that regions, they can have co-protection, co-benefit, and sharing the benefit together. And In summary, I would say that in order to improve the eco-compensation work during the 14th five-year plan, it's really dependent on different support from different domestic international communities, especially ADB support, because we have a long-term cooperation with ADB for such a long time. I remember that the first international symposium was taking place in 2009 in Shizhuishan of Ningxia, the autonomous region. And I would say we have already more than a decade of cooperation. We have joined the hand to implement a series of eco-protection projects, and lots of achievement has been made. And that made a very active and positive contribution for China's eco-compensation mechanism establishment. And last year, we have applied for Global Environmental Fund and Yangtze River Protection Project. And the term of this project is 5 years, which will cover the whole 14th five-year plan period. The green financing and eco-compensation are a major objective, and we need to explore different ways, including natural capital labs and others. ADB has done lots of preparations and very detailed work in preparation period. I hope that this project, during this project, I hope that we can have your continued support. And I also hope that take this symposium as an opportunity. We can establish a platform for mutual consultation and mutual exchanges so that we can work in together to carry out all the eco-compensation work during the 14th five-year plan. And that's, as a result, we hope that the eco-civilization can enter into a new level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In terms of future partnership with ADB, you certainly have the right people on the webinar today to talk to you about that. Let me invite Dr. Gretchen Daly to talk a little bit about the natural capital projects, the key tools that she's seen evolve. And Dongmei Guo, can you mute, please? Thank you. Gretchen, are you online?
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Wonderful. I was having a little trouble with my internet inside, so I'm sorry I'm in the dark seated outside. But let me, first of all, thank you very much, Chairman Evans, and all the who have helped to orchestrate this really important and timely movement. And tremendous pleasure to be on with everyone. And I will just try to address your question quickly to support the broader effort that we're all contributing to. Let me try to share my screen. So you asked specifically about the development of tools. There we go. Is that visible to everybody?
Yes, yes, it's
okay,
clear.
I'll try to sit a bit more in the light here. So our whole aim is to support what everyone has been underlining, and namely a rapid shift, a deep cultural shift in awareness of the values of nature and in our ability to integrate those values into all of our planning, our policies, our finance, our management practices on the ground across the oceans. And we do that very much through science, through technology, and through partnerships that inform all of the work. So briefly, just looking at these tools since 2005, we aim overall to help drive this transformation at scale and at speed. And there are three main arenas in which the tools are being used today and toward which we want to tune them to be ever more helpful to decision makers. So number one is in targeting investments, using the very latest data and science that are coming in to measure the return in nature's benefit to people, the return on regenerative investments in nature. Same for economic security, dimensions of security and recovery. The second is scale success through deep and work with partners to launch ever more ambitious and ever more compelling demonstrations. So far, we have worked in 60 countries and directly and partnered with about 50 research institutions and many, many implementing institutions. We see the major multilateral development banks as a tremendously powerful scaling platform for going much farther than anybody has in this arena to date. And then, of course, we want to track performance using measures like GEP or GEEP, as Professor Wang, Chairman Wang presented, a natural capital index that we're developing together with the World Bank, critical natural capital, many other approaches that we're developing with different partners. So briefly, so you can see the tools, the idea is firstly that they're available freely and openly. They map and value the benefits of nature provided over landscapes and seascapes, and they can be focused at different scales on cities up to country levels and the world. They enable decision makers to quantify trade-offs between alternative, let's say, investment or management choices to achieve the types of goals that everybody has been putting forth. And second, they enable targeted investments in places, in people, in projects that will enhance human development in an efficient way, but that primarily is oriented around sustainability and more inclusive types of growth or development. So the tools look at many different realms where we need to be thinking about the contribution of nature to protecting people and property on coastlines from climate extremes, clean water and energy. And you can look around, there are many arenas. These are a few in which the tools are now tuned to deliver. And we want to get ever better and ever more focused on the arenas where decision makers and major investors see the greatest opportunity. We most recently are launching now a suite of tools tuned to sustainable, livable cities that required the very fine scale data that are now streaming in, especially in some of the world's cities. We're first applying these in China in the PRC and in Latin America. And overall, these tools have been used in most countries. What we need is ever more co-development, as we've done from the beginning, with international experts at many different levels. So we meet normally all through the year and now more and more by Zoom to understand how best to help with this transformation, how best to make the science accessible and actionable with different leaders. This is President Alvaro Quesada from Costa Rica with Chris Field, who will be speaking soon, visiting Stanford. And here is a high-level delegation from the PRC led by Mr. Ma Qiang a few years ago. So we've worked all over, and example arenas include on water security for city, finding how to make those investments in upstream source areas that benefit downstream cities, residents, industry, hydropower, and so on. Looking at coastal climate resilience here in the Bahamas, with special tools showing the places most vulnerable to sea level rise and storms, and where to invest to achieve the greatest protection and multiple benefits. Here in the PRC, looking across the entire country at where investments would most pay off to deliver on these national level priorities. And finally, in the PRC, and picking up on the mechanisms of eco-compensation, showing where to invest and in which people to achieve the restoration that is so crucial and being measured through GEP. Training many people, and hopefully through these natural capital labs, many more, and working with IPBES to quantify change in nature's benefits that we now can model globally and at very fine scales, such as change in water pollution, in coastal risk, or in lost crop production and the impacts and costs thereof to livelihoods and human health, where we find that by 2050, it's possible that 5 billion people will be at greater risk of these different losses and impacts on nature if we don't act quickly. So finally, here's the summary slide. And I want to thank everybody again for the tremendous spirit and commitment and expertise, energy and creativity that I know can all pour into this work together. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Daly. And so let me now invite our third and final panelist, Ahmed Saeed, the Vice President, to give us some thoughts on how to scale this excellent work that's ongoing in particular in China, how he might see ADB and ADB partners scale this up into other parts of his domain, if I can call it that. Thank you.
Well, it's our domain, but well, look, first of all, Warren, I think maybe just to pick up where Professor Daly, a comment that she made, which I agree with wholeheartedly, which is just that MDBs are tremendously powerful scaling platforms. And there's a number of reasons for that we've talked about, but I think it's certainly true. And we're going to have to live up to our potential and more to help achieve what's possible. I think this was a really interesting session. Really a really broad range. I was really interested to hear what Martin is doing and sort of the initiatives in those, sort of in the private sector. I think we're going to need scale there, but it's going to depend on the ability to achieve scale is going to depend on a number of things in other sectors that I think were also touched on in this session by Academician Wang Jinan, by Patricia, by DG Tong, and of course by Professor Daly. Turning specifically to our role, maybe just to answer the question that you laid out to the entire panel earlier, what are we doing to take advantage of our ability to help scale things? Maybe I could just, close by briefly trying to identify or share 4 examples. And I am conscious that we're a bit behind schedule, as is almost always the case in these sorts of events. The first I won't dwell on for too long because Patricia spoke about it and provided an excellent overview of the Southeast Asia Flyway initiative. This is something we're working with her and her organization on. It's tremendously important. It's an effort to develop a long-term pipeline of investments and technical assistance for the protection of habitats for rare migratory birds. And our goal is to protect and restore important bird areas within East Asia and the Australasia Flyway. I think it's a great example of the sort of thing that the ADB can help scale across a complex region and bring to fruition. But we have also, as you noted, been taking this work in East Asia and in the PRC to other parts of Asia as well. In Southeast Asia, one example that I would point to is our efforts in the greater Mekong subregion We've been supporting natural capital and biodiversity investments through something known as the Core Environment Program since 2006. And we have recently established a new $5 million technical assistance program to improve land use management across the GMS, embedding within it innovative compensation mechanisms for ecosystem services and for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And this is also complemented by training on landscape conservation, on forest fire management, and natural regeneration. I think this is an example of something that has built off of lessons learned in East Asia, and something that we're going to be quite active in Southeast Asia. We also have done quite a bit. We talked earlier about the Yellow River and the Yangtze projects and the efforts there to focus on water-sensitive interventions. We've expanded these efforts elsewhere in Southeast Asia, both to Indonesia and to Cambodia, for example, where we're working on improving access to water supply and sanitation services. Where we're financing construction of stormwater and wastewater collection and treatment mechanisms, and where we're making efforts to use nature-based solutions, solid waste management infrastructure, and community-based on-site sanitation and hygiene promotion to bring a circular economic approach. As I recall, those were really central to our efforts in the Yangtze and Yellow Rivers. And then it's really a very different set of issues we confront in the Pacific, although also there we're building on work done in East Asia. As we all know, there's just a huge negative impact from ocean waste and from solid waste generated in small isolated countries. And so our efforts here are really focused on integrated solid waste management. The long-term vision here is to have clean islands and a clean ocean. And we really have to operate at 3 different levels in the Pacific: the local, the regional, and at the ocean scale. And we are trying to scale initiatives as an institution across all of these levels. At the local level, we're focusing on waste volume reduction. As you know, there's just very, very limited landfill space on islands. At the regional level, we're promoting the economy of recycling as it's more viable at a regional level. There are everything from old cars to abandoned appliances across the Pacific that need to be recycled. And then I think, most importantly, from a global perspective, because it has relevance to everyone, is the ocean scale, where we're making efforts to integrate the management of ocean waste. The issue of plastics and of floating waste is incredibly important in the Pacific. We are, investing in efforts to improve the availability of innovative financing, such as blue financing. And the goal is to use this 3-scale process, local, regional, and ocean, to create win-win situations for the Pacific and for the rest of Asia and the world. Let me just pause there. Those are just some examples of how we're trying to scale our efforts. I think the issues of measurement, the issues of standardization, the issues of bringing private capital to bear, all of these things are embedded in those initiatives. And I think were highlighted, Warren, by you and by the other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. We are running late. I apologize for that, but I think that this was extremely valuable. I learned a lot, and I want to thank each of our speakers and our panelists for the leadership that you're showing in this area. If you take a look at who has just spoken during this session, these are some of the key leaders globally in moving the agenda forward on valuing nature, natural capital, and really integrating those values into a broad conservation approach to development, what we call sustainable development. So let me thank you and turn this over now to my colleague Qingping Zhang, who is the Director of the Environment, Agriculture and Natural Resources Division in the East Asia Department. And also, I got to say that he is one of the driving forces here in ADB on these issues as well. So Qingping, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Warren. This is Qingping. As Warren just introduced, my team now work on a Yangtze River Economic Bio Initiative, Rural Revitalization Program, and also Natural Capital Lab. I'm very happy to moderate this session. This session is intended to compare our loads on natural capital investment between different organizations and establish a stronger partnership for future. For this session, we have 5 speakers, and each will have 10 minutes to present their perspectives. Let me now invite our first speaker, Dr. Chris Field. Chris is the director of the Stanford Woods Institute for the Environment. He was co-chair of Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from 2008 to 2015. He is also a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. Today, he will present on the role of the natural climate solutions to address global ecology and also climate change issues. Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for a session that has just been fascinating so far. I have really enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to sharing a few thoughts about the role of natural climate solutions in solving the climate challenge. We've talked about a very wide array of elements of natural capital to date, and some of the simplest are the ones that are related to addressing the climate challenge, but they have a number of important nuances that it's important to get right. And the area that I want to focus on today is developing the interface between contributions to climate change mitigation, decreasing the amount of climate change that occurs, and contributions to climate change adaptation, which is in essence the whole spectrum of other natural capital assets that we've been talking about. But there's a tremendous set of opportunities here, and I think a lot of the path forward is going to be to take advantage of developing markets for mitigation and figure out how to extend those effectively into issues that are more related to adaptation. Let me start out by emphasizing that when we talk about natural climate solutions for mitigation, we're really talking about 2 important parts of solving the climate challenge. The first is decreasing emissions from ecosystems and contributing a significant portion of the mitigations decreases that need to occur to stabilize global temperature at well under 2°C above pre-industrial. But natural climate solutions can also go beyond that. They can constitute negative emissions that contribute substantially to our opportunities to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions in an environment in which we continue to have emissions that are associated with the most difficult to decarbonize parts of the global economy and global food system. The take-home message from my comments today is that the essential element of natural climate solutions is preventing deforestation in the tropics, figuring out how to make the markets for preventing deforestation robust and practical to undertake and practical to quantify, and the work on gross ecosystem product is a huge contribution to that, although there's still more to do, especially in countries that don't have the infrastructure for careful quantitative work on their forest assets. So as I said, there are really 2 fundamentally different features of natural climate solutions that it's important to keep in focus. One is slowing emissions of greenhouse gases through reducing deforestation, reducing degradation of forests, improving soils in croplands, and protecting coastal areas with mangroves, salt marshes, and peatlands. And then a very wide range of natural climate solutions that is associated with increasing sinks and generating negative emissions. China has been spectacular, but we're seeing countries around the world make really profound and important investments in improving forest management to increase forest stocks, reforestation, planting forests in areas where they've been removed. afforestation and forest plantations to expand the global area of forest, improving the management of soils in croplands and grazing lands so that their carbon content and fertility increase simultaneously, adding various kinds of supplements to soils like biochar to increase their carbon contents, restoring croplands to prairies or savannas that can have much higher carbon contents, and restoring coastal ecosystems. I want to make sure that everyone puts those natural climate solutions in the context of the global carbon budget, where obviously the two problems that we're trying to address are, first of all, the emissions to the atmosphere from fossil fuels, which have to be brought to zero regardless of the other steps we take. And second, the release of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere as a consequence of deforestation is currently occurring in the tropics. You can see from the magnitude of 80% of the recent emissions coming from fossil fuel combustion and only 13% coming from deforestation being a clear indicator that stopping deforestation can't solve all of our problem, but it can make a meaningful contribution. I also want to highlight the fact that in the recent several decades, uptake of carbon by natural ecosystems on land has sequestered nearly 30% of the CO2 released from industrial activities and deforestation, and uptake of CO2 in the ocean, which has made them more acid, has taken up another 22%. When we talk about solving the climate challenge, no action is more important than protecting these natural sinks. And we can do that partly through good stewardship, but also by limiting the total amount of warming that occurs. Incredibly important. So I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about what the capacity of these natural climate solutions is and how much they can contribute to the overall challenge of solving climate change. And there are really two questions that need to be addressed. What are the processes that control how much carbon we can put into the terrestrial ecosystems, and where can we put it? How much can it hold? How susceptible is it to later loss? And then a second related question is, when we think about adding carbon to terrestrial ecosystems especially, are we primarily refilling stocks of carbon that had been lost as a result of previous human actions, or are we building new kinds of sinks related to human innovations that are added on top of fundamental ecosystem processes? The answer is certainly a mix of those two, but much of the agenda has to do with refilling carbon sinks that were emptied as a result of earlier human actions. And we have a pretty good idea of the total amount of carbon that's been lost to the atmosphere from ecosystems as a result of human actions. And this is a plot of all the published estimates. The midpoint of those estimates is around 750 billion tons of CO2 lost to the atmosphere. So in an ideal world, we might be able to utilize ecosystems to restore approximately 750 billion tons. But ecosystems have been acting very actively to increase carbon stocks, essentially providing a free subsidy from nature over the last several decades. And the best estimate of the total amount of land sink over the last 50 years is approximately 500 billion tons of CO2, which leaves a remainder of something like 250 to 300 billion tons of CO2 that could be refilled if the agenda is totally refilling. If you look at all the published estimates of the potential carbon that could be taken up in terrestrial ecosystems, the midpoint of those estimates is pretty close to this 300 billion tons number. And I think that's a wonderful aspirational target to think about and to shoot for. When we do that, we also need to recognize that there is a vast range of co-benefits that come from careful stewardship of our forest and other ecosystem resources. And these are essentially the ingredients of natural capital. And it's wonderful to see the bank and a wide range of stakeholders recognize their value and try to build ways to incorporate them in formal market mechanisms. I want to close with two thoughts. The first is that when we look at utilizing terrestrial ecosystems for natural climate solutions, we need to remember that in an era of climate change, we're looking at a wide range of threats to those carbon stores, and they range from disturbance to direct effects of climate to biotic agents and attacks by bugs and things like wildfires. And we need to be attentive not only to the good stewardship associated with initial protection, but providing ongoing protection. When I look at the broad agenda for natural climate solutions to advance climate change mitigation and adaptation, there are 4 points that jump out for me as overwhelmingly important. The first is that no part of the agenda is more important than bringing deforestation down to zero. That's something that is affordable, it's practical, and it just requires a dedicated effort and the allocation of the necessary resources. The second is that as we look at natural climate solutions, we need to remember that we receive currently huge free subsidies from nature, and especially by limiting the amount of climate change that occurs, we need to protect those free subsidies, and there's no more important call for quick action than the protection of existing carbon sinks, preventing the natural world from vicious cycle feedbacks that make the climate challenge much more difficult. It's also clear that natural climate solutions alone can't solve our climate challenge, and they shouldn't be used as any kind of argument to delay action on reducing emissions from energy and industry, but they can be deployed now, and they can be important elements of a balanced portfolio. I'm optimistic that the kind of initiatives we're hearing about today, especially where natural climate solutions can be valued in terms of both their contributions to mitigation and to adaptation, can help unlock their potential. And we really have a tremendous opportunity to advance this agenda. I want to thank the ADB and the wide range of stockholders that you've brought together for giving us the tools and the incentive to help advance the agenda of protecting ecosystems and solving the climate challenge. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thanks not provide us such a great insight how to link biodiversity conservation with the climate change agenda. I fully agree with you. It's a great opportunity for us to highlight the core benefits between the natural capital investment and also address the climate change. Let me now turn to our second speaker. The second speaker is Mr. Duncan Nang, Senior Environmental Specialist from the Sustainable Development and the Climate Change Department of the ADB. Duncan has rich experiences in investing in biodiversity conservation. He's currently coordinating efforts to develop ADB's first biodiversity strategy. Today, he will present the ADB's biodiversity roadmap and also the directions for establishing a natural capital lab in the regional level. Duncan, floor is yours. Duncan, are you there? Silver, is there any way we can find the Duncan? Can you hear me? Danke. Can you hear me?
Jinping, this shows that he's on. We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Jinping, you're loud and clear. We cannot hear Duncan.
But we cannot hear the Duncan, right?
Right.
Probably the best approach is that we just move to the our third speaker. Is okay? Warren?
Yeah, I think you should move on to the next speaker.
Yeah, so you guys can hear me very clearly, right?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so I just acknowledge the great speaker for from Stanford. Chris, he gave us great insights on the linkage between the biodiversity conservation and the climate change. Now let's move to our third speaker, Greg Watson. He's a lead specialist for Multilateral Capital Lab for Inter-American Development Bank. As many of you already know, the lab serves as a one-stop shop for the ADB group to drive the innovation in the conservation, landscape, biodiversity, and the marine ecosystem finance spaces. Greg will discuss the key tips, how they have established the lab, and will also share with us what lessons can be learned from their experiences. I trust a lot of experiences that he can transfer to ADB and the World Bank. Greg, floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and I hope that you can hear me and see the presentation. Thank you for the invitation. I'm just going to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about the IDB's Natural Capital Lab. It's an initiative we started in 2018. And as you said, I'll walk through a little bit about why we did this, how we did it, and some of the things we're doing now. When we first started thinking about this, it's because then President Moreno of the IDB wanted us to take a different look at the way that nature and natural capital was being handled at the bank. We have our traditional natural resources departments. We have our traditional departments that are looking at agriculture and similar areas. But he really wanted us to take an asset-based approach. And I put these two quotes here because I think that they are useful background for the way that we were thinking about this. We wanted to have nature have a seat at the table with finance ministers, regulators, and central bank governors, and use that kind of asset language. We also wanted to link the nature and climate agendas a bit more. Climate change had been rightfully getting most of the attention for the last decade. And we thought that it was time in our region, where biodiversity is incredibly rich and important, to start to look at where those two topics intersect, but also where nature itself has an important role to play in GDP growth, development, and services to people. So what do we do at the IDB's Natural Capital Lab? We are a risk-tolerant hub. We work with different departments across the bank group with blended finance, with concessional capital, expertise, technical assistance, grant projects. And we also do our own projects to provide a runway to good ideas that we think deserve to be tested in this space. The agenda includes both, so the team that I work with and lead is now leading the mainstreaming of biodiversity across the bank and also in countries of the bank, but also the finance piece. And if you ask us to talk about really what our mission is, it's converting that idea of decision makers and investors that nature is a cost, and putting it on the asset and revenue side of the balance sheet, both in terms of the way that it's framed, but also in terms of the kinds of projects and investments that are done. How do we do that? We're trying to demonstrate the value of natural capital to growth, employment, provision of services, quality of life, especially in the COVID recovery period, where these are going to be probably the driving forces of national development plans, national infrastructure plans, and national economic plans for some time. We also, somewhat rarely for an institution like the IDB, we work with both the public and private sectors at the same time, trying to create those bridges. And like I said, we provide resources. This is a timeline just to show the bit of our development. We started with the concept in 2018, but we didn't start from scratch. The bank in its natural resources division had a bio program, which was working on various different programs. It had worked with Gretchen and her team in the Bahamas in basically looking at ways that natural capital played into different scenarios for development of an island, which led to a $25 million loan of the bank for this kind of incorporation of natural capital. So that experience was there. I previously had worked in IDB's lab on financial innovation in these topics, and we really brought them together. That same year, the government of France, President Macron at the UN pledged resources for the lab. And in 2019, we formalized those agreements. We passed through our board the agreements to create the fund. The government of the UK made in a contribution focused on marine ecosystems, blue carbon, and the associated co-benefits. And then the IDB each year also kicked in about $1 million so far each year to provide us with money to do some of the more experimental early stage work. But we also, I should say, work with the budgets of individual departments of the bank. So we approve projects with the funding of the IDB lab. We started working with the JEF on a $10 million program for chemicals and waste in the Caribbean, which actually should be finally approved this year. And we've worked with the different conventions, right? So we had a meeting at the pre-COP with ministries of finance, talk about nature-based solutions and to start to make these links for the climate COP. We've also been engaged with the people at the CBD. And right now in 2020, actually this number is a bit old. We probably have about 30 different activities or work streams moving across the bank. The NatCap lab has actually become part of a larger natural capital cluster, which is now also looking at mainstreaming. If I look at our theory of change, and really it's a bit of what I said before, but if we look at nature as an asset and know that natural capital is contributing to all of these services we've all been talking about, and we kind of diagnose the problems, on one side, tools, knowledge are scarce, and that's a lot of what we've been talking about today in terms of training and capacity building on the different tools that are out there for quantification, for making these value cases. And so we do have a knowledge agenda. But if we look at really the finance issue, and there's this famous McKinsey study that shows that there's about a $350 billion hole per year for financing biodiversity, how do we fill that hole? And it's really through two sets of activities, in both with the public and private sector, and they all depend on making the value case. And if I kind of look at that, we need to make public finance more efficient. We need to remove kind of cross subsidies and cross programming. We need to move beyond the Ministry of Environment into other public sources and look into see how we mainstream within countries so biodiversity is upstream incorporated into infrastructure projects, nature-based solutions are considered. So we start to carve out pieces of the budgets of those ministries, like Carlos Manuel was saying. And then if we look at the private sector and the public sector for that matter, we can look at the financial architecture that already exists. Second-tier financial institutions, microfinance institutions, venture capital funds. How do we deploy that towards this area? Do we need to create new structures, experiment, create new kinds of assets, and how do we crowd in capital? And if the bottom, you just see some of the thematic areas that we talk about: conservation finance, forests, landscapes, oceans, coasts, nature-based solutions, technology, chemicals, waste, and corporations and technology. And I'm not going to spend much time on this slide, but it shows you a bit of our approach, which is we have the team which both manages the mainstreaming agenda of the cluster, which is looking inside the bank and really embedding natural capital into our country strategy. So we're actually working with the NatCap team at Stanford right now to start to look at how do we create the economic case for our country strategy for Colombia as we move forward to update that. We work with the departments to provide them with the funding and expertise they need to do different projects, working with the country's ministries of finance, working with policy-based loans and the triggers and those that are around these topics, and then tracking taxonomy and pipeline. But on the innovation side, we're looking at financial products, which you see listed here: bonds, debt for nature swaps, new assets, risk capital, new business models, so entrepreneurship, MSME, value chain, large corporates, and then technology, both technology and the financial infrastructure, so green bond transparency platforms and the like, monitoring systems for impact so that we can show the impact to the investor or to the government, and finally investment platforms that map where projects are happening and can link them using artificial intelligence to investors, to basically start to create these portfolios, and also platforms that can do early warning systems and the like, or create results-based payments mechanisms. I'm not going to talk here much because all of us probably know this, but for us, it's very important to look at the concept of biodiversity and natural capital in these different ways, and to be very clear as to the approach that we're taking and the value that this might have to different audiences. And many people say to me, well, are we talking about biodiversity or natural capital or nature-based solutions? And I generally say, for the purpose of our work, I don't really care. I think we need to use the words that are the most relevant to the audience that we're working with. And the words that we use with scientists are different than the words we use with the Minister of Finance or the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. And so this is just to really say that we need to translate these concepts between audiences, and that's a lot of our work. And then just on a couple of models, we did a diagnosis of financing gaps and where we could be most catalytic. If you look, traditionally, there's a lot of money going through NGOs to developing new business models, new concepts, but those businesses will come out of that curve and be stuck between these first two boxes, where they need a ticket of a $500,000, $400,000 to get the real proof of concept that can attract an investor like HSBC or Althelia or one of the like. So we found that having risk capital available is really important, and being flexible in the kinds of instruments we use. And then for scaling, we've found that national development banks and second-tier banks and creating special purpose vehicles for investment has really been an interesting way to think about this. And you can structure all sorts of kinds of bonds around that too. When I talk about financial instruments for risk capital, we're moving beyond just traditional debt, equity, and guarantees. We're talking about reimbursable grants, contingent recovery grants, convertible debt, simple agreements for future equity. So trying to really move to that innovation space that is really not being funded right now because of the way that we set up our financial architecture. And for us, that's been very important. And then just, to talk about a couple of things that we've done in terms of structures, this is where we found, if we're going to work, I guess I should take a step back, but if we're working at the lower end of this model, and with these kinds of structures, we've created an accelerator for businesses in the Amazon region that will provide all of these kinds of products to get the pipeline of ideas out there and businesses out there. Once you have a large enough pipeline, so for scaling, we've started working with our capital markets team and with second-tier banks where they create an SPV, a special purpose vehicle, with different tranches of funds, with an associated technical assistance vehicle for the businesses themselves, to then lend through financial intermediaries to the end businesses. And we were very far in design of something like this in Peru, and we're planning on doing this in additional countries. And depending on the model that you have, you can actually issue some bonds off of this if you want. And then just lastly, to close, these are some of the more interesting projects I think that we've worked on. One is a new asset class for nature, where we've invested in an exchange where you actually can trade the value of natural capital, and where you can do an IPO of that value. It's very complicated, and I don't not enough time to talk about it, but We were early stage investors in that, and that's moving forward. Looking at different kinds of species bonds. I think a lot of us have heard of the rhino bond in Africa. We're looking at a jaguar bond that would be around basically land use, but you use the charismatic species as a hook. Ensuring natural assets. So looking at coral reefs as infrastructure, and then how do you ensure that so that after a natural disaster, it can be cleaned and repaired quickly and maintain its value as a natural asset. Looking at habitat and offset banking, where you have the mitigation hierarchy that requires a company to restore degraded land. You know, how do you move that to private credit models? And we invested in an early stage company in Colombia to prove that this transaction model could work. And now it has been proven, and it's actually something that we're working on expanding. So that's a little bit of the history and a little bit of what we work on with our team of 6. But you know, our team of 6 grows exponentially because we work with the departments of the bank in developing our pipeline. So that's all I had to say, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Greg. Very happy to see you make such great progress since we met in 2018 in Stanford. Now I hope you can find time to visit the ADB in Manila one day. You know, of course, you know, we look forward to meet you in Biodiversity COP 15 next year.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Greg. Right now, I saw the Duncan already come back, so I invited Duncan to share with us about the biodiversity roadmap, and also the directions for ADB's Natural Capital Lab. Duncan, floor is yours.
Thank you, Ching-Feng, and sorry everybody if I got cut off there.
Duncan, you still unmute yourself. Can you unmute?
Sorry, you are on mute. You are now mute. Can you unmute yourself, Mr. Lan?
Yeah. Can you unmute yourself?
Right. Hopefully you can hear me now. I got thrown off just before, so thank you for stepping in, Greg. So at the moment, ADB, we are at the process of developing our biodiversity roadmap, and we have the idea, the concept of also bringing in the Natural Capital Lab into this. Yep, I am unmuted, I think. Ching-Feng.
I can hear.
I can hear you.
I can hear Duncan well.
Okay,
I can hear
great.
very well.
Thank you very much. Okay, and the development of our roadmap, it's really at the moment a bit of a process. You know, we do have a strategy in place, you know, a strategy 2030. We have operational priorities. We also have a lot of work we're already doing on biodiversity. So what we've been doing is trying to work these things to then think about what our biodiversity roadmap may be, and the opportunities that are presented with that. And also we've been thinking about where the Natural Capital Lab may sit within this. So for those of you who don't know, we do have a strategy 2030 that came into being implemented in 2019. I won't go to detail with it, but there are some very good hooks in terms of biodiversity. So, you know, there are things that we can pull on, but essentially the strategy is not there specifically on biodiversity, which is why we felt we needed to develop our own strategy and a roadmap to deliver on that. But surprisingly for some, perhaps, because ADB is kind of maybe thought of more of an infrastructure bank, we do a lot of projects, or we have done, in biodiversity. And you can see from the quick list here, there's a number. Most of them are in Southeast Asia, as VP Saeed was talking about, as well as in East Asia and China. So they're the main areas where we have been doing biodiversity projects. In addition to this, we also do quite a bit of work in our thematic areas on things like illegal wildlife trade. We've also been doing work on with BirdLife again to develop a sensitivity mapper so that wind development can be done. Nature-based solutions, trying to scale that up, green business, and also in the Pacific particularly, there's a very important point on building our Healthy Ocean Action Plan, which is a really big initiative that we've been doing over the last few years since 2019. So with all this in mind, we've been now trying to pull all this together to try and work out what our road might look like. We have, the idea would be to get this done, to approve it in 2021 or 2022. It would run on maybe a phase of 3 to 5 years initially. And really we try and focus it in areas of greatest threat, and also areas of highest biodiversity value. During the initial phase, because we already have a lot of projects in biodiversity or with some elements of it, we would probably try and focus on delivering of those projects and also developing a pipeline for a second phase. And I've kind of tried to group the strategy into kind of 4 main components, which I'll talk about in a minute. Now, it's very important to say that while we are developing our strategy, there are other initiatives that we already have that are ongoing or in development that will be absolutely essential to delivering on our roadmap. Patricia talked around, as well as VP Saeed, about the Flyway initiative. This will be an essential tool for us to deliver on the roadmap. Secondly, we have the Ocean Action Plan, again, another one. And today what we're talking about is Natural Capital Lab. Again, this will be so important, and I will mention that later on at the end. So of the 4 components, I've kind of split them up. And some of these really touch very closely with some of the things that have been said by other speakers today. We have a lot of commitments made by our developing member countries. How do we turn those into project commitments? We really need to work on that country partnership strategy planning level. We need to give a voice to some of the ministries which don't necessarily have a voice. We need to get them to the table. We need to work with our governments and maybe focus our efforts on projects which have co-benefits, not just for biodiversity, but where they can also deliver great economic returns as well. At ADB, we kind of, I think, need to focus on leveraging on projects where we have grant resources that are used. We could employ them when we're trying to do our partnership strategies at a country level, but we could also use them to trial and push for more biodiversity focused projects where our grant resources are greater. And in China particularly as well, it's worth noting that because of the nature of our investments in China, that also gives us a great opportunity to focus more on biodiversity. The second area where our roadmap is focusing is also on projects that we already have that are ongoing. We do a lot of projects, as all the development banks do, and we have a lot of policies in place, but they're not always delivered as they should be to address biodiversity issues. And so we feel there's a number of ways we can improve that. First off is to try and use technology better. There's a lot of GIS tools and mappers. The invest function was really interesting to hear about that, and I think we would be interested to learn more about how we could integrate that into what we're doing. We have a lot of policies that we need to improve our compliance on. So again, that's something we need to look into. And the other point maybe to mention here is that ADB is actually looking to update our safeguard policy in the next couple of years. So this presents great opportunities for us to do more in the biodiversity space. Net positive is something that's being talked about. And also it's an opportunity where we can try and do further innovation in what we're doing, possibly aggregating offsets when we're thinking of country planning, etc. And lastly, trying to scale up our capacity within our developing member countries. This is very important because we need, at some point, ADB may not be lending, so we need the countries to take this on themselves and to implement projects and deliver them during the operation after our investments have finished. The third area, and probably the most important today, is really trying to expand our portfolio of projects with biodiversity components. I won't go into this in detail because I think everybody else has talked about this, but this is definitely in ADB's strategy of what we want to try and do. Nature-based solutions, projects with those, you see a few examples here. Sustainable agriculture, sustainable natural resource use. We need to scale up our projects in this area, but they need to be, we need to make sure that they are delivered. We're all here on a call today. Perhaps we wouldn't be if the pandemic was not there. We're increasingly getting interest from doing projects which are talking about animal welfare and illegal wildlife trade. And these are areas we need to look into as an institution and include in our roadmap. And lastly, I put down innovative financing. I kind of feel like after Greg, what I have here is kind of a bit light, but anyway, the strategy is a work in progress, but these are things that we really need to explore on. Debt for nature is something that I think is a really interesting area and something that I'm particularly interested in. We are also looking to expand our green bonds and blue bonds to issue some next year. So this is something that's quite exciting. And lastly, of our four kind of structured areas, there's obviously the knowledge sharing and strategic partnerships. We all know the CBD COP is coming up next year. We will be part of that. And it's important that as part of our roadmap, we maintain our involvement in these type of events. We have BirdLife here today, and it's important that we work with other key NGOs who work in the biodiversity space. They are the innovators. They know about what is, what needs to be done, and it's our job to try and help deliver those things. So it's very important we work with WWFs, TNCs, and so on. The other point is we need to continue our work in the thematic area with biodiversity and also in innovation. We need to pilot projects, we need to do guidance, we need to do knowledge products, build capacity, etc. I've listed a few areas that we're kind of focusing on at the moment, but this would likely be scaled up. And also, it's very important that we work with other development partners. Many other MDBs are working in this space. AFD, for example, has a biodiversity roadmap and strategy themselves, and they've even set targets for how their investments will be. ADB is not at that point yet, but it's somewhere I think we would maybe like to go in the future, similar to what we have with our climate stuff. So with this all in mind, where does the Natural Capital Lab sit in with this? Well, this is kind of a summary slide of where we are. The lab, as we heard earlier on, will hopefully be launched at CBD COP next year. And really the idea of it is to build this enabling environment to be able to scale up these investments. I won't dwell on this too much because I think we've all heard from the other speakers of how this would probably work. But if you can see on the slide there, there's the kind of four key components of the lab that would help build this framework and this enabling environment that we could then would help us scale things up. And I should also mention that the lab that we have in mind, we're really focusing at the moment on the Yangtze River Economic Belt and the Yellow River Ecological Corridor. But as VP Saeed said, the idea would be to hopefully scale this up across the bank if it was successful. And based on what Greg was talking about, this seems like it could really work and could end up being a hub for all our innovation across the bank. So going back to these 4 points, we really need to improve the accounting, make people realize the value of nature and it's worth investing in. We need to improve the regulatory frameworks. We heard so much earlier on about the eco-compensation, and that's fantastic. We need to scale that up and keep improving it. We also need to galvanize and increase this financing, bring in the private sector, and we also the lab would also provide that platform for partnerships to form, so that we can then take scale up investments, etc., and it would be a place where innovation would happen. So under the lab, there's a couple of projects that I just give you as a showcase from our colleagues in East Asia Department that they've provided to me. We have first one is the Sishui Sustainable Watershed Protection and Development Fund. This is under development at the later stages of it at the moment. And as you can see, we've got essentially the watershed there is one of the few in the Yangtze River Basin that is not been dammed. It's a lot of the people there are using the natural resources as a primary source for them. And so the economic development has to be done in a very sustainable way. So the fund would be set up so that the economic development could be delivered, but without destroying the natural environment. And that would be the key focus of the way the project would work. ADB's use of the funds would be then used to catalyze further funding and also to develop those market-based instruments to ensure that there was compliance, but also the project survived into the long term after ADB's involvement. And the other way with which that would be delivered in the long term would be building a technical advisory service, improving policy, strengthening institutions so that then it could be delivered in the long term. And the second project, just to give you a last example here, is the ADB Silk Road project. The name is maybe slightly misleading, but it starts at the beginning of the Silk Road and would involve building, well, essentially creating a large forest corridor which would go across 3 provinces. And the forestry sector is maybe been quite traditional in China, and the concept would be to do a more ecologically focused forestry project framework, and that would and it would also look to expand on the different things that could be done in the forests, like tourism, recreation, also improving biodiversity. And the other thing that the project would look to do is working with communities doing community-based forestry. And there's a good potential pipeline there in that project. And the other thing that I think is a very interesting innovation with this is as you can see, the Alibaba Ant app. And Alibaba has set this up so that if you do good activities like riding a bike, then you get credits, and eventually these result in a real rather than virtual tree being planted. And so this app and the Alibaba have been linking up. The plan is to link them up with this project so that the areas where the trees may be planted or the long term would be actually done in an ecological way, because planting trees is great, but they know that it needs to be made sure that they survive into the long term. And that's one of the other things that's great about the Alibaba idea, because this could run for many, many years. And say, for example, if you have a community and they have a community forest that's planted, if you use this app, then it may provide that financing in the long term, way after ADB is involved. So that's a great incentive to the local people to keep their forests and to maintain it into the long term. So it's a very interesting and innovative project. And again, this one is in the Yellow River Basin. So with that, I will finish. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Duncan. I think the comprehensive presentation you provided going to be very useful for competitive loads with the ADB and the World Bank and many others. So let me now come to our fourth speaker. Our fourth speaker is Irina Akhachova. She is a senior operations official with the International Finance Corporation, IFC, based in the Washington, D.C. Irina, she has led the IFC's 2019 report, namely Green Buildings, a Financial and Policy Blueprint for Emerging Markets. It's a very influential report, very impressive. Today, she will present how to mainstream biodiversity finance across the projects and operations. Irina, the floor is yours. Irina?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah,
can you?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Can you see my screen with the presentation?
Yeah, we saw it. We saw it. No problem. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to you today and share IFC's experience. Just a couple of words of introduction about IFC. IFC is a member of the World Bank Group. We're the private sector part of the World Bank Group. We work in over 100 emerging markets. And last year, we have invested $22 billion in private companies and financial institutions. About 1/3 of our investments last year were in climate business. And climate considerations are very much the way we're thinking about building sustainable business models and financing those sustainable business models that protect biodiversity. So for IFC, we're really looking at the intersection of nature and climate mitigation and climate adaptation issues. And it's important to say that that's not replacing IFC's long experience in risk management related to biodiversity in all of our activities. Biodiversity considerations have been integrated in IFC's projects in terms of how we approach risk management through our performance standards, social and environmental performance standards. IFC's performance standard 6 specifically addresses biodiversity issues and living resources, and has become a global standard for financial institutions, corporations, and policymakers when it comes to sustainable finance. So what I want to talk to you about is the work we have started about a year ago to really look beyond risk management in our projects and focus on how can we help stimulate the development of sustainable business models and then finance those models that protect biodiversity. So we decided to start kind of at the beginning. For us, as an investor ourselves, it would be very important to define what are the boundaries of biodiversity finance. How do we define what those type of activities would be? So important caveat here is that this work is still ongoing within IFC, so I won't be able to share with you the final taxonomy of investment projects that fit within the biodiversity finance category. But what I'm going to do is to give you a sense of the principles that we have applied and how we're approaching this work, and give you examples that will help illustrate our direction of thinking and where IFC is going with this work. So we're defining biodiversity finance as finance that contributes or intends to contribute to activities that conserve, restore, or avoid negative footprint on biodiversity and nature contributions to people. So based on this definition, to be considered biodiversity or nature related, investment activities should address at least one of the following key drivers of biodiversity loss. And these are the key drivers that the Convention on Biological Diversity have identified: land use change, overexploitation of resources, pollution, climate change, and invasive species. It's important to note that in this particular case, when we talk about climate change, we're not going to count any project that IFC does in climate change arena as something that would be considered a biodiversity finance project. For a climate change component to be considered within the biodiversity components have to be very localized. So an example of that could be a restoration of a cloud forest in a particular area, or restoration of ecosystems with species that could withstand higher temperatures, for example. We're also not making a distinction whether financing that we would provide to our client companies would be based on companies' voluntary actions, or whether they would be driven by market considerations such as access to organic markets, for example, or whether these activities are driven in response to government regulations. The way we have started to develop this taxonomy is that we're focusing on most relevant SDGs, SDG 14 and 15, life below water and life on earth. We decided to apply use of proceeds approach rather than KPIs or performance-based approach. And this is largely due to a range of difficulties that continue to exist in measuring impact on biodiversity. Having said that, that doesn't mean that we're not going to be looking at the impact our investment activities have on achieving biodiversity objectives. But what we're doing is applying frameworks that have become very familiar to many investors and to a lot of our clients. So we're building our taxonomy of biodiversity-related investment activities within the framework of the green bonds and the green loans. Those two frameworks already include biodiversity as an accepted use of proceeds, but only at a high level. There is just a reference to biodiversity projects as an accepted use of proceeds, and there is no detailed list of what those activities entail. So what IFC is trying to do is to develop those indicative list of investment activities and investment components that would provide a granular look at what those assets could be, which would help us identify those assets in our business development activities, in our portfolio, but also engage with our clients and develop a range of biodiversity-related finance products that we could offer to our client companies. So the indicative list of investment activities is grouped into three large categories. And I want to note the process that we have followed to develop these three categories. First, we looked at a lot of our climate definitions, because as I said at the beginning, a lot of projects in biodiversity space have climate components. So we started off with the definitions that we already have that look at sectors where nature and climate intersect. We have engaged with a lot of private sector players, such as pollination, for example. A colleague was on the panel earlier to discuss the emerging business models and emerging financing approaches that we see across the private sector, and particularly focusing on models that generate financial returns for investors. And we also reached out to the NGO community and actually worked very closely with Wildlife Conservation Society to develop this draft taxonomy. So the three categories of investments that we're looking at are the following: investment activities that generate biodiversity co-benefits while supporting established business operations. So what do we mean by that? What we mean is supporting existing companies, but earmarking our financing, for example, for shifting to more nature-friendly production practices, or supporting companies that are already relying on nature-friendly production practices. The second kind of subcategory in this could be financing waste prevention or recycling activities, financing pollution prevention and control, or even manufacturing products that reduce pollution harmful to biodiversity. An example of that could be, for instance, choosing to finance a producer of lyocell as a fabric that displaces cotton over time, for example. And I agree with Martin from Pollinator Group that this is an area that already generates financial returns for financiers and investors. And this is probably the group of projects that would be the first ones to take off and be most investor ready. And I'll give a couple of examples in a minute of what we mean by some of these projects. The second category of investments are those that support biodiversity conservation as a primary objective, directly financing conservation or conservation-related services. These remain a bit of a niche for mainstream investors at the moment, but we're seeing very encouraging models being developed around the world, and both in emerging and developed markets that we hope to identify and be able to support the growth of investments in this particular area. And the third one has been mentioned multiple times during today's session is investment in nature-based solutions, where biodiversity is used to enhance ecosystem services to address a number of challenges, whether it's flood prevention or dealing with stormwater runoff. So let me just give you a couple of examples within each of these categories. Investments that generate biodiversity co-benefits, they could include projects that focus on climate smart agribusiness, for instance, intercropping, regenerative agribusiness practices, freshwater and marine sustainable production area that could include investments in sustainable aquaculture production, biodiversity friendly shipping. For example, IFC financed MSC Shipping Company, the largest container shipping company in the world, to retrofit their fleet with filters put on ballast water tanks to prevent the contamination of invasive species. Forestry and plantations, there has been a lot of conversation about those projects and ecotourism services, for example. Investments in biodiversity conservation could include payments for ecosystem services based on biodiversity conservation, investment in wetland or marine area conservation restorations to develop biodiversity credits or carbon credits, for example, provision of services for restoration of natural habitats. And in terms of investments in nature-based solutions, we are seeing a lot of interesting models emerge in the developed world among municipalities and utilities, for example, that use green infrastructure to solve a range of issues that utilities typically deal with, such as the volume of water, quality of water, and utilities have been calculating that restoration of wetlands or forests could help generate significant savings in avoided costs to invest in gray infrastructure to filter water, for example. Municipalities have been using a lot of green infrastructure solutions to deal with stormwater runoff, with floods. And what's interesting, while these approaches are not new, but what's interesting is that we're seeing increasing role for private investors to come in. I think the key issue here, and again, these topics have been covered earlier, is to really be able to quantify these benefits and monetize them. So right now, this is the kind of work that has been done on a project by project basis and requires quite a bit of effort. But there are some approaches to move more towards some sort of standardization. And I think once more investors participate in many of these projects and make good returns, there will be more appetite. But it is really crucial to figure out how we quantify the benefits that nature ecosystem services bring and how to monetize them. And for that, the continuous development of carbon markets is absolutely critical. I know that we're running a bit late, so I'll pause here and I'll be happy to answer questions when we do the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ariela. That's a wonderful presentation, very relevant to ADB's future biodiversity roadmap. I very much like your approach. I use the process approach, mainstream the biodiversity into the operations and also the project in the future. Now, let me turn to our last speaker. Our last speaker is Giovanni Lutra. He is a senior environmental economist from the World Bank. He has led the design and the implementation of green growth and sustainability policymaking in DMCs. Today, he will discuss how to mobilize a private finance for biodiversity conservation. Giovanni, the floor is yours.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me well?
Yes.
I guess you can. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be with you. So I know we are really beyond the time. So I'll basically say two things. One is give you a sense of our economic modeling efforts to support governments understand the materiality of nature, and not also only government but also the private sector. That's a big question in everyone's mind. The second one is to show the messages from our recent report that which we prepared together with the IFC, with Irina, who just preceded me, and give you a sense of how we're seeing biodiversity finance and how we are sort of thinking about it. So on the first point, why is nature important? The economic evidence, I don't need to repeat you that, biodiversity underpins the, 12 SDGs in a direct way. Our comprehensive wealth estimates, which were, the idea of measuring capital, natural capital, was discussed in the previous panel. And we do an effort, which, by the way, Warren, it's a pleasure to see you spearheaded when he was at the World Bank. Our wealth estimates show that natural capital, in particular renewable natural capital, which includes forest, agricultural land, protected areas, is particularly important in the poorest countries. So they show a very important dependency on natural capital. The flip side of that is that they are exposed to the risk of depleting or degrading natural capital. Now, to understand that risk story, we have a starting point. We measure our economy with models, and we measure the impact of changes in our economy with models that take nature as external to it, and not really relevant very often. So our general equilibrium model that we use, for example, for planning purposes, are really misinformed in that sense. At the same time, we have economic models that tell us how environmental quality or environmental services flow change with change in physical conditions in the physical environment. Now, if we manage to integrate these two concepts and into integrated models, then we get to something that allows us to do the type of work of green, for example, green GDP that was discussed before. And that's exactly what we're doing together, by the way, with the Natural Capital Project. And Gretchen, it's really nice to see you here. And once we integrate economic environmental models, we can ask the model questions about how material are environmental risks to economies, because economies are interrelated, and they are interrelated with nature. They're actually embedded in nature. So we see, for example, our preliminary estimates that reaching certain tipping points could curtail GDP growth across the world, and low-income countries are very hardly hit by that. So this is, in a sense, to say how the environment is material. And then, of course, the next question is, where are the sources of that? This chart comes from the World Economic Forum. 3 socioeconomic systems, food, land use, and ocean use on the first place, but then also infrastructure and the built environment, energy and extractive. They account for 80% of threatened species around the world. So the private sector playing a big role in these sectors then is an important aspect. The funding gap for biodiversity was mentioned earlier, and we identify now. I'm starting to talk about how we really think about private sector engagement. The barriers the private sector faces to engage on this field are first of all perverse incentives, and Carlos Manuel presented that very clearly. You know, there is a very big amount of financial flows that go in the opposite direction. Yes. Okay. So the second problem is lack of data, measurement, and standards. And the third is the often very localized nature of biodiversity project. So moving forward, the way we see greening finance is, in addition to working with the corporates and the private sector, to also recognize the role that the financial sector plays. And the recent months have seen a series of reports that really look at the financial angle of biodiversity conservation. So, for example, the Dutch Central Bank has prepared a report measuring the. There is a lot of background noise, at least in my headphones. There are important risks that the financial system faces. Similarly, the BIS has published this report on the emergence of green swans. You know, we're very familiar with the concept of black swans. When climate change and natural events are unexpected, but they are also low probability, but with very high impact, they are so-called green swans, and they can affect the economies in a systemic way. And finally, the Polso report that I just mentioned puts a little bit of a sense of where the numbers and the financing is. And so the financial sector starts to recognize that nature risks are systemic. And we think this is an important aspect of the story here. Is not only about the local impact, but it's also the fact that it can reach a dimension that we have not seen. And if we needed approved, you know, the imbalance between natural capital and human capital is what we're observing now with the current crisis. In terms of how we're framing then the thinking around finance, we're borrowing this terminology from the climate change finance literature. We see two critical dimensions of financing biodiversity, and the two critical dimensions are across the return from investments, which is obviously an important variable for the private sector, and second, the impact on ecosystems, the impact on biodiversity and ecosystems. Now we see that very often investments are concentrated in one of the corners of this box, except the top right, the top right corner. So the effort that we have to undertake consists in moving the action upwards and rightwards. So moving towards the right means overcoming the challenges with cash flow, with the rate of returns from investments. And we're seeing that the market is developing. We call that financing green, and we see the market developing tools to do that. The second type of movement, which is going from the bottom of the possibility space here to the top, going up, is about greening the financial sector, greening the business as usual finance, and improving the environmental and ecosystem impacts of the investments. Now, whereas in the case of climate change, we see that there is a lot of opportunities in terms of moving on the financing green dimension, so left to right. There is a lot of opportunities in terms of investing, for example, in renewable energies or in technologies that overcome the current climate change problem. In the case of biodiversity, we seem to have a much bigger opportunity in terms of the greening finance. It's sort of the next frontier of the finance world, and we think tapping that is very important. So with that framework, we suggest in the report that we just published a month ago, 5 borrowing from the biodiversity literature. We have a big 5 also for private finance. The first one is, of course, environmental fiscal reform, removing perverse subsidies or repurposing perverse subsidies. The second one is to provide data. Data are important for decision maker at the level of planning, ministries of finance, but also for central banks as financial regulators, as we discussed. So the establishment of a task force on nature-related financial disclosures, which is now on the making, is very important because will sort of be the house in which all these issues will be discussed and will propose a way of thinking to the financial sector and the private sector. Similar to the fourth is similar to the climate change, establishing a Nature Action 100 with the 100 most impactful companies on nature is probably an important avenue to catalyze action in the short term and find quick wins. And finally, providing catalytic capital that addresses the problem of small scale and localized nature of projects. So here is the importance of the Natural Capital Act at the Inter-American Development Bank, but also what the Asian Development Bank is setting up. It's quite remarkable. So I'll stop there and thank you again. Thank you for inviting me. This is really a great opportunity. It's been a great event this morning.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. They are very great presentation. I learned so much, particularly your concept there. We're really indebted to nature. We really need to speed up for our efforts in natural capital investment. Now for session 3, we have the 5 speakers from Stanford, ADB, World Bank, FC. As you can see, one of the speakers made excellent presentation from different perspectives. It's very clear, strong need for stronger partnership. ADB, of course, we can share our experiences and lessons learned, but most importantly, ADB can learn so much from the ADB, World Bank, FC, and Stanford. I saw this box that say many of the audiences express their strong interest in your presentation. But right here, we little bit run out of the time. Many of the speakers, particularly for those in Europe, essentially they don't have the sleep today. They are fully committed to this very important topic. Instead of have the Q&A, I think we better close the webinar. But before we close, I would like to invite DDG Wang Tong from the National Development and Reform Commission, and also the DG Lynch from the Asian Development Bank to provide their insights and also the closing remarks. Firstly, I would like to invite DDG Wang Tong to give the closing remarks. He is a key champion in the NDRC on equal compensation and the natural capital investment. He got his PhD from the Agriculture and the Forest University in China. So DDG Wang, the floor is yours.
OK， 各位女士、先生，
声音特别小。I'm sorry, the DDG Wang's voice is very low. Now I can hear him.
Yeah, DDG Wang, can you close your microphone a little bit? Close your microphone. Yeah, okay.
各位女士、先生，各位来宾。
Ladies, gentlemen, dear guests, good morning. So in this morning, we have this international symposium on eco compensation. I think that with the joint effort of all the parties who joined and involved, and also with the great support from ADB, this symposium is very successful. And all the speakers has talked about and shared with us about insights in the natural capital and the eco compensation and eco protection. I think that we have learned a lot and it's very inspirational. So here are some summaries from my perspective. The eco compensation theory and the practice is the main topic, and we have exchanged our ideas on this. For the scaling up of eco compensation and eco protect study in 1998 in China. And for major regions, major tributaries, we have improved the system, and we have made great contribution in balanced economic development across regions, and also the poverty alleviation. And many government agencies like NDRC and others has done a lot of work in this, and we have making very leading efforts internationally. We have improved the concept of eco compensation, and we have arrived with principles and clarify all the rights and definitions. And this work is developing on a way more like law-based and legal-based. So it has a very active role for the eco compensation in China. And right now we have already gained lots of achievement. But as for targeted efforts, we still have room to improve. So last year, NDRC has released the pilot program plan for eco compensation. It's covered over 50 counties across 10 provinces. And we encouraged the pilot programs to have different methods of the eco compensation fund. And we hope that they can enhance their development and share their experiences with the rest of the country. And next step, we will combine those two elements together and to carry out the work of Natural Capital Lab and summarize all the experiences, successful lessons in the past, so that it can lay a very good foundation for our future work.
Ladies and gentlemen, China has attached to the great importance to eco compensation, and in recent years our efforts have been stepped up to covering more areas and benefiting more people. In the future, we will work together with you to do more theoretical research and practices to deepen the systematic improvement. We hope that you could continue to be interested in and support the eco compensation work in China. We will continue to work with ADB and the Global Environment Fund to strengthen our cooperation to explore the effective international model in eco compensation and come up with China's policies, case studies, and absorb international practices and experience, so as to contribute China's wisdom and case studies to the world. In the end, on behalf of NDRC, Regional Revitalization Department, I would like to thank ADB and Global Environment Fund and Stanford for your effort in organizing this conference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, DDG Wang. Maybe we look forward to have the closer cooperation with ADB-PRC. Let me now invite the DG to give the final closing remarks for the webinar. Many of the DG is a key champion for natural capital investment and green finance in Asian Development Bank. DG Lynch, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Jinfeng. And I think that all of us would agree that we've had a very, very rich discussion today, which has provided all of us with a very solid foundation to build upon as we move forward. I'm not going to try to summarize anything or everything, but one thing I will say is that we will make available all of the PowerPoint presentations to everyone so that you can have that as a reference. As I said at the very beginning, today's webinar is the first in the series of 3 events. The second event is planned for January 2021, and this will focus on the role of private sector investors, including commercial banks and large corporations, to leverage biodiversity finance and natural capital investments. The third event, which is planned for February next year, We'll focus on the building blocks for an ADB-wide and regional platform for the Natural Capital Lab, the PRC's pioneering approaches in the Yangtze River Economic Belt, and new initiatives for the Yellow River Ecological Corridor will be discussed as models for South-South cooperation in Asia and the Pacific. And ADB's developing member countries will be invited to participate in order to share their own approaches and experience. So we do have our work cut out for us in order for us to launch the virtual Natural Capital Lab at COP15 in May next year. And I think we've certainly gotten off to a great start today, and a huge thanks goes to all of you as both panelists and participants for making this event possible. And I would also like to express my sincere appreciation to Jinfeng and his team for all their efforts in planning today's webinar and bringing us all together. One final housekeeping detail: I've been asked to request everyone to turn on their cameras so that we can take a photograph. So let's try to do that. So I'll pause for a moment, and everybody, let's try to connect and turn on your photos, 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 your